Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
"Mommy, I'm cold," said 5-year-old Kelly said calmly, mundanely. Not complaining, just giving information. She was the one who cried at first, but then somehow even accepted their new life. Not for nothing they say that children quickly adapt to everything new. Perhaps Nancy Mom Girl was even harder to get used to the fact that over the past year, hunger and cold have become integral parts of their lives. "Be patient for a while. Daughter," affectionately she said, trying to hide the traitorous shiver in her voice. "They'll bring the stove to be heated. Porridge for their own. Everything will be all right. My darling." "I know, Mom," replied Kelly confidently. "Let me help you with the firewood." No, I got it," Nancy hastily replied. She stepped out of the decrepit shed and tried to make sure her daughter didn't see the tears on her face. It wasn't hard to do. The only light they had was provided by an old oil lamp. Of course, it was simply not capable of properly illuminating all the rooms, and often Nancy thought it was for the best. The shed was cramped with one single window under the low ceiling, where instead of the long drunken glass they put simple polyethylene film. True, in several layers. For better heat preservation, the sunlight penetrating inside became dull and dreary, perfectly harmonized with the shabby furnishings of the room. The only furniture here was 2 narrow beds, a small closet, an old stove, which served the mother and daughter as a stove for cooking and heaters. The only consolation was that the barn was solid oak logs, so it was in no danger of collapse or a hole in the floor or ceiling. In fact, it had been used as a temporary home for the family a long time ago, before they built a new big and spacious house, because it was not easy to live here, but it was possible. Nancy herself, come to think of it, had grown up in more difficult circumstances, though that fact was hardly a comfort to her. At first, though, she had been about the age that little Kelly was now. Everything in her life was fine. She herself, of course, did not remember those times very well, and relied more on her mother's stories. She often recalled what a wonderful man, husband, and father Nancy's late father had been, working and then not helping and babysitting when he had time. And of course, he loved Mom very much, just as she loved him. And they lived, as they call it, soul to soul without any quarrels and scandals. They raised their daughter, saved money for a larger apartment, planning that soon little Nancy would have a brother too. The only thing that marred this relationship turned out to be Nancy's mom-dad. Her mother didn't like her mother-in-law from the very moment the young people met each other, and she didn't even think about hiding this fact or trying to get in touch with her daughter-in-law and get to know her better. She was the kind of woman for whom their children, especially their sons, make up their whole world, are the meaning and center of all their dull and gray life. Such see their offspring's partners not as their personal happiness, but as their misfortune, and see them as rivals for their precious child's attention. That is why Nancy and the mother had no chance to get along with her mother-in-law, though she tried her best to do so. She tried everything. She came to visit with flowers and candy and tried to find common interests. Even had nothing against the fact that her husband all weekend spent not with her, but with his parents. Everything was in vain. Any contact between them ended in an ugly scandal arranged by her mother-in-law. Nancy's father, caught between the 2 women he loved, was also unable to find ways to reconcile them, despite his best efforts, so he shuttled between them, trying to give each of them enough attention without offending the other. Maybe it's the constant tension. That's what ultimately caused him to pass away too soon. Yes, in addition, for the reason that rarely takes young people away, he was not yet 30 years old when a heart attack brought him to the grave. Nancy's mom, of course, grieved terribly, but had no idea that major trials were yet to come for her. A few days after the secret father was buried on the doorstep of their apartment, the mother-in-law showed up. Mom at first even rejoiced at this visit. She decided that there is a blessing in disguise. Maybe now, having lost her son, the woman will show at least some interest in the only reminder of him that remained in this world, his daughter, and consequently, her own granddaughter, whose existence she had not even noticed until then. Of course, after all that there could be no more warm relations between the two women, but perhaps they would have turned from openly hostile to neutral and calm. But that wasn't the case. The mother-in-law had other plans, and she didn't come to reconcile with her daughter-in-law and share her grief. "What's up, bitch?" She started right from the doorstep. "You've gotten your way and you've driven my son into the grave." "Miranda, what are you talking about?" That Molly, the mother, was confused. "What I am saying is the truth I am saying. I always knew this was how it would end. From the moment I saw you, I knew it right away. This girl will ruin my Leshchenko. He must run away from her." But he did not listen to me. So he paid for it. "Miranda, I understand your grief, but you're unfair to me." "Oh, unfair," the mother-in-law exclaimed. "I'll show you justice. Such a viper." She literally threw in her daughter-in-law's face some very weighty folder. And while the thin mother opened it and tried to figure out what it all meant, she continued her monologue. "Take this." She nodded contemptuously at the little Nancy with frightened eyes, looking out of the cradle at the whole scene. "And get out of my apartment so you won't be here before tonight." "What do you mean out of your apartment?" More surprised. What did Nancy resent? "Mom, we bought it when we were married. It is a jointly acquired property, which now belongs to me and our daughter, your, by the way, granddaughter. And you look at the documents," said the mother-in-law. "And what? Just so they gave you the apartment." Leshchenko wrote on me. At least on this, he had enough brains. And that, you see, jointly acquired while my poor son humping at work at 12 o'clock a day. "You've been living off the books here, haven't you?" Of course, the daughter-in-law could answer that she worked before Nancy was born. She even went on maternity leave just before she gave birth, and before that she worked as hard as her husband. But she wouldn't do it. In the first place, because it was useless to argue with her mother-in-law. She would not listen to any arguments anyway. And secondly, the woman simply did not have the strength to say anything. The fact is that she still looked into the folder and made sure that her mother-in-law said the truth. The apartment, according to the documents, belonged to her. And this could only mean one thing. From that moment on, both she and her young daughter were homeless. What followed was several years of unrelenting hell. They moved around in some communal apartments, often changing them as the rent went up. The mother's small salary was barely enough to support them, and there was no one to help them. After all, the woman was an orphan. Her strength was only enough to somehow drag her only daughter to adulthood, for which she was very grateful. And even the day Nancy turned 18, her mother went to meet her father. Her heart, too, could not bear all the strain and turmoil that had been heaped on her fragile shoulders. So she was left alone. Now she had to earn her own living, the good of all that was needed. Her mother had time to teach her, and in addition, showed her a perfect example of how carefully one should treat the choice of a life partner. And the very young girl promised herself that she would never repeat her mother's mistakes and would not allow her children to live in such conditions as she herself had to live in. Because of constant moving, Nancy often had to change schools. Often it turned out so that she only had time to get used to the new place, but had to break off again and go to another neighborhood, or even the city. Of course, under such conditions, she studied not too well, and the question of entering the university in front of her did not even stand, and the early death of her mother made it impossible for her to get a higher education. To feed herself, the girl had to get a job right after graduation. She was lucky. Probably the first time in her conscious life, she managed to get a position as a sales consultant in a very expensive clothing store. Of course, the work was hard and quite boring, like any unskilled labor. However, it was still a better option than getting a job as a cleaner or dishwasher. And the salary she was offered was quite decent. With that money, she could even rent herself a decent room. One of its main advantages was that it could be locked from the inside. Nancy's life was very monotonous. Work, home, work again, and so on. The girl didn't have too many weekends, and it could be called her personal choice. She herself took a large number of extra shifts to get more money. In those days, she earned as much as her mother had never dreamed of. However, like many children from poor families who had a very difficult childhood, she had fallen into one of two extremes between denying herself everything and fanatically hoarding money for emergencies and mindlessly spending it. Nancy chose the second option. The thought of not buying something she didn't really need but could afford was almost physically painful. Fortunately, she did not get into any loans and debts and lived quite well within the means that she had. Nevertheless, Nancy spent all her salary without a trace, often on things that were not necessary at all, on pretty brooches, bracelets, trips to cafes, movie tickets, and other pleasant trifles. Often she told herself that it would be good to start saving. Even once she thought that if she limited herself to only the really necessary things, she could have already saved, for example, for the first installment on the mortgage, or just create a very substantial safety cushion. In her mind, however, realizing how important all of this was, Nancy could not bring herself to start saving. Emotions whispered to her that she was doing just fine now. There didn't seem to be any emergencies. She was doing well, so she could not be afraid of dismissal, as well as, for example, the ruin of a very popular chain of stores, one of which she worked in. And every time she listened to her emotions, which were stronger than the voice of reason, of course, then scolded herself for it, but could not fix anything, and only promised herself that from the next paycheck she would definitely begin to behave more reasonably. Which, of course, never happened. That's how she lived until she met Charles. He came into her store, completely unplanned, in the mall where Nancy worked. He was supposed to have some very important work meeting, but on the way out, his pants were rolled up with mud by a passing car driver. Here was a man looking for more to his good fortune. Charles arrived at the meeting well in advance. It turned out that he didn't have a typical clothing size, and Nancy spent almost 40 minutes trying to find some pants that would fit the man more or less decently. Finally, she succeeded. He was satisfied with the quality of service and promised to come back for more shopping sometime. Something to brighten up the long search. Nancy and Charles were having a very lively conversation, and if at first it was just about the weather outside the window, then they talked about other topics, including the fact that they liked the same music and the same movies, and found some more common ground. He came in again 2 weeks later with a coffee stain on his jacket. In a strange coincidence, it was Nancy who served him again. When she saw that the customer had the same problem again, she couldn't help but laugh. To her surprise, Charles was not offended at all. On the contrary, appreciating the ridiculousness of the situation, he joined her. "And you excuse me," Nancy said at last. "It's just that it's really kind of funny." "You don't say." He echoed a second time in the same place. "And you're here again. Either your mall has some kind of enchantment or the universe is subtly telling me that it's better not to deal with these partners. Don't think this happens to me all the time. Honestly, 2 weeks ago was the first time in my entire life. Or maybe it's our store that's bewitched." Nancy smiled. "Attracted to you. It makes a certain amount of sense," Charles replied. "But it's probably not the store itself that attracts me, but one of its charming employees. To tell you the truth, I've been thinking about you all these days." "Oh, that's very nice," Nancy said. "And I think I'll answer frankly to frankness. I've been thinking of you too. I think we had a very successful conversation last time," Charles confirmed enthusiastically. "Well, if that's so, let me ask you when your next day off is expected." Nancy had never been so happy about the end of the month. They had extra shifts at the beginning of each month. That's because she hadn't had time to pick up any extra work yet. And the next day off she had to come in just a couple of days, and she informed her new acquaintance about it. Their romance developed rapidly. Both of them never believed in such nonsense as love at first sight, and both of them found it. Already in a month they were practically inseparable, spending all their free time together. Nancy, to the surprise of her superiors, even stopped taking extra shifts. Of course, Formally, it was not a prerequisite for work, but everyone had already gotten used to the fact that the girl always helps out her colleagues. In addition, it was accepted in the store, albeit unspoken, that a certain number of extra hours were taken by all employees without exception. And now, when Nancy decided to work only those shifts, which were assigned to her under the contract, in the team began serious conflicts. The girl still performed her work well, not giving the bosses the slightest reason for her dismissal. However, no one could prevent them from depriving her of her bonus, which was a large part of her salary. And her coworkers started to shit on the smallest things, literally making her stay in the store completely unbearable. Nancy, in spite of everything, did not even think of giving up. She continued to simply perform her duties, despite all the difficulties and obstacles. However, with her new salary, she was no longer able to afford not only entertainment, but even to rent a room. From Charles, Nancy hid her problems to the last. But of course, he could not help noticing the changes taking place with his favorite woman. "Nancy," he said one day, "I'm sorry, of course. Perhaps I'm minding my own business. But there's something that's been bothering you a lot lately. Is there anything I can do to help you? Or at least just listen? Sometimes it can be really helpful to talk things out. Just a little trouble at work." She waved it off. "Nothing particularly serious, right?" Charles asked, looking at her intently. "Right." Nancy tried to answer firmly and confidently, but her voice shook involuntarily. Charles continued to stare at her without saying a word. He realized that the matter was much more serious than she was trying to make it seem. But he also realized that if he questioned her, Nancy would simply shut herself up and certainly not say a word to him. So he waited patiently for the girl to gather her strength and tell him about her problem. And so she did. After a few minutes of tense silence, Nancy, tired of pretending, burst into tears at the table of the cafe where they were sitting. Charles embraced her and started stroking her back and head, letting her know that he was near and ready to support her in any situation. Finally, she calmed down enough to speak, even though her words were jumbled. Pity with them, sobs behind them. "You see, it's actually because of you. I mean, I'm not saying it's your fault. In fact, you had nothing to do with it at all. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. Nancy, just tell me everything from the beginning." "From the beginning, yes," she echoed. "You see, when you and I started dating, I stopped taking extra shifts at the store. It's not technically illegal, but I understand," Charles echoed. "But they can't fire you for that, can they?" "Of course they can't fire me, but they can take a pay cut. I don't know how to live on the money I get now, not enough to buy food or rent a room. I'm afraid that I'll soon get into debt or something like that. I have absolutely no idea what to do in this situation." "What do you mean, what?" Charles was surprised. "Quit. If the conditions are so unbearable, is there any point in putting up with them?" Nancy tried to object, but the man didn't let her say a word. "I understand what you're saying. That's exactly what they want. If you fire them, they all kind of benefit. So be it. Do you want to work in a group like that?" No. Sadly, Nancy sighed. "And I hadn't even thought about it. But if now I have enough money for food or shelter, when I quit, I won't have enough for anything. And it's not like I'll be able to find a new job anytime soon." "Well, first of all, I'm sure you can. As far as I can tell, you're a pretty good salesman. There's a lot of talent out there. I think your employer's competitors are gonna have a field day with you. And secondly, why would you want to live in a room with strangers? Come to my place. I think this step in our relationship has been a long time coming. I've been hesitant to invite you, and my income is enough for the two of us." Charles, "Well, it's a little awkward, Nancy. I don't want to sit on someone's neck, especially not on the man I love. I'm not dating you for your money or your business. Don't worry, honey, I'm well aware of that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making you this offer. It wouldn't be a pleasure to have you in my apartment." Still, Nancy was not ready to accept this generous offer so immediately. For another 2 weeks, she walked around pondering whether she should move in and quit her job. The rapidity with which their relationship was developing was somewhat frightening to the girl, but in the end, she made her decision and agreed. After all, Charles was certainly right about one thing. She would be able to find a new job anyway. And if things went wrong in their life together, she could rent another room and move out. So why not give it a try? It often happens that when people start living together, they quickly find out that they are actually incompatible. There are domestic conflicts, or even it turns out that it's not very easy to bear each other in a small piece of space every day. In the case of Nancy and Charles, it was nothing like that. On the contrary, when the two moved in together, it was as if they had become even closer and closer to each other. The wedding was fast approaching. There was only one thing that confused the girl. Finding a new job was not as easy as they had thought it would be. Nancy was really a good saleswoman and had learned a lot while working in her store. She had everything one could wish for: experience, knowledge, skills, and an innate quality suited to this line of work. Nevertheless, no one wanted to hire her. The girl even began to suspect that this is a kind of greeting from previous employers who gave her a disgusting characteristic. However, most likely, it was something else. She was even too good for her job and had the appropriate salary expectations, and no one was willing to pay her the money she was asking for. It was easier to hire less talented girls who were able to do some work, but who wanted less money. But of course, no one talked about it openly. Otherwise, Nancy might have reduced her appetite. But alas, she had no idea that this was what had to be done. "Come on, Nancy," Charles urged her. "I told you 1,000 times what I earn. It's enough for the two of us, even the three of us. I mean, when we decide to have a baby. And if something happens to you, would you mind?" Nancy, oh, what could happen to me? Get hit by a streetcar, or a brick fall on my head. So something like that can happen at any time, including before you even get a job. You can't be safe, honey, but it's worth a try. Well, see, you've been trying for a month now, and it's no use. Well, at least for the relay race. You deserve a vacation. Let's get married. We'll go on a vacation, and then you can go on with your search, if it's so important to you. In the end, Nancy agreed with her fiancé and went into wedding planning. She wanted the celebration to be perfect, so she tried to think about every little detail. Then it was time to meet Charles' mother and her future mother-in-law. Frankly speaking, this moment with Nancy was postponed to the last. But now, on the eve of the wedding, it was quite impossible to avoid it. Unless, of course, we take into account the absurd variant when they will get acquainted directly at the solemn event. The fact is that Nancy was terribly afraid of meeting her future mother-in-law. I remember the terrible experience of my own mother and paternal grandmother. She understood perfectly well that if the relationship does not work out, will come to an end, and her romance with Charles, no matter how much she loved him, it will be impossible to live constantly expecting a blow in the back from his mother. She will certainly be expecting it, even if those fears prove unfounded in the end. This, in turn, may well spoil the relationship and with her husband, and even lead to a painful breakup. So it would be better to break this connection. At once, it will be less traumatic for everyone involved in the events. Of course, Nancy did not share these concerns with her fiancé. He might have taken them to mean that she herself was prejudiced against his mother, though it was not so at all. On the contrary, she sincerely hoped that she would be a nice, kind woman, and that they would be able to find a common language. Charles, who was very sensitive to his bride's moods, did not ask her about anything this time. Of course, he could see her excitement, but he wrote it off as the usual wedding condition peculiar to many women. He even considered himself lucky. The future spouse, not crying all day long, is engaged in some quite constructive activity. Good for him. Besides, in these hectic weeks, Charles was working much harder than usual. He had to get the money for the wedding trip he had already promised Nancy, and he had a great deal of business to attend to so that nothing would fall apart in his absence. After all, being the owner of his own firm, That's a big responsibility. And so the day finally came when Nancy was to meet Charles's mother. From the very morning, she made a fuss, cleaned the apartment, which already shone with crystal cleanliness, cooked, even did the laundry and then dried it with a hairdryer. You can't show a guest and hang her son's underwear out to dry. Nancy, honey, don't be nervous. You said so, and Charles, I'm sure Mom will like you without all this preparation. And if she doesn't, trust me. I've known this woman for years, Charles said with a laugh. Besides, if she doesn't like you, she won't like you. And what will it change? The main thing is that I love you. And my mother doesn't have to. Nancy bit his lip painfully, but kept silent. It didn't matter to him. And from her point of view, if not everything was at stake, then a lot was at stake. It was this meeting that would determine whether their wedding would even happen and whether the relationship would continue. But of course, it was not worth it to frighten Charles with these thoughts beforehand. It was enough that she herself was on pins and needles. At exactly the appointed hour, the doorbell rang, and Nancy hurried to open it. On the threshold stood a woman, quite friendly looking, holding a cake exactly like the one the hostess herself had bought for the table. She had no time to realize whether it was a bad sign or a good one. The girl on the machine politely said hello to the Bones and invited her to come in. As it turned out, a little later, the same confectionery turned out to be a good omen after all. Molly, the mother-in-law's name, laughed when she saw the same cake on the table, and then happily concluded that since they had similar tastes in sweets, they would somehow manage to agree on everything else. She was a cheerful and pleasant woman. By the end of the dinner, Nancy was chatting with her as if she were an old friend whom she had known since childhood. The bride's mood was rapidly improving. Nothing was going to stop her from marrying Charles, and it was definitely the best news of her life. They had a very modest wedding, not even because they were against noisy and left-field celebrations. It just so happened that there was no one in particular to invite to it. Nancy's parents were long gone. She had no time to make friends. Charles, head over heels in his business, didn't have too many friends either. His father, as it turned out, had died a few years ago, passing the family business on to his son. "What happened to your dad?" Nancy asked me one day. Charles instantly became as serious and focused as the girl had never seen him before. But it was not even this that struck her, but the fact that his face showed not only sorrow, but extreme thoughtfulness, as if his father's death were not a personal tragedy for him, but a mystery he could not solve. You see, it was a strange story. They said he had a heart attack. He was only a little over 40. My dad wasn't even 30 when he died of a heart attack, noted Nancy, who didn't find that fact particularly surprising. Yeah, but mine was perfectly healthy. And I'm sorry, but you told me yourself he had a busy life. Stress and all that. And I doubt he was as obsessed with his health as my constant running around to doctors, mandatory annual checkups, that sort of thing. And he made me and my mother get checked. And there was no sign that he had any heart problems. And then all of a sudden he had a heart attack. It's really weird. But you don't think somebody killed him, do you? Poisoned him or something? Honestly, that's what I think. But why? I mean, you ended up with the business. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been yours for years and you're fine. Could there be any other reason? You're right, of course. Maybe I was just overreacting. I did go to the police, but they didn't find anything suspicious. Seeing how hard it was for Charles to think about the story, Nancy never spoke of his father again. After all, even if he did die of causes other than natural causes, it was unlikely they would ever know the truth, although she personally thought it more likely that the man had actually had a heart attack. All sorts of things happen, including to perfectly healthy people. After the wedding, Nancy and Charles went on a fascinating trip to Europe. The girl, who had never been abroad for a month, came back from there filled with impressions. She felt absolutely happy. She had never experienced such emotions in her entire life. Now, however, they were back in their hometown, and life flowed as it should. Nancy resumed her search for work, which remained as unsuccessful as ever. True, it didn't upset her so much now. She was sure that her husband would help her through any difficulties. And indeed, she felt like she was behind a stone wall. A few weeks had passed since their return from their wedding trip. When Nancy found out that she was pregnant, she hurried to share this joyful discovery with Charles. But his reaction was not what the woman had expected. She had hoped that he would share this happy moment with her. But instead, he almost started tearing his hair out. "Charles, honey, aren't you happy we're having a baby? You wanted one too, didn't you?" "Didn't you?" Charles sighed. "I still do. I really do. I don't mean that. It's just that it's a terrible bad time." "What do you mean?" Nancy was worried. He looked long and earnestly at his wife, as if assessing what was worth saying, what was better left unsaid. Or maybe he was just gathering his strength. The woman could clearly see how hard it was for him. And besides, she remembered some other facts that she had not paid attention to before. For example, that after Charles returned from Europe, he worked even harder than he had just before the wedding, and certainly more than before. At the very beginning of their acquaintance, and it was supposed to be the other way around. He had settled a great many things before he left, and now he should have been freer. Was it a mistress? A traitorous thought flashed through her mind. Nancy immediately brushed it aside, and was even ashamed that she could have thought such a thing. But what mistress indeed? When would he have had time to get to know her? If they had been together all the time lately. Unless it was before they were married. But then what was the point of getting married? No, it's obviously something else. I mean, Charles finally said, "My business is falling apart. And all I've been doing since we got back is trying to stop this avalanche with my bare hands. I'm sorry. I didn't want to bother you, so I didn't tell you. But now that you are, well, I'm obligated to notify you so you can decide what to do about the pregnancy." "What do you mean by that? What can I do with it?" "Well, maybe it's not the right time for a baby. I'm guessing you don't have much time left." "So no," Nancy interrupted sharply, realizing what he was getting at. "No, darling, whatever it is, I don't intend to get rid of our child. We're going to raise him well anyway." Charles agreed obediently. "But keep in mind that I may soon be left with literally nothing. And now, I'm not even sure I can get a decent job fast enough. But how could I?" Nancy shook her hands. "Everything was fine when we left, wasn't it? Or did you just not want to upset me then?" No, you've got it right, haven't you? Things were really good and great back then. I don't know how that could have happened. And in just a month, it's a total nightmare. I won't bore you with the details, but there's been some weird tax fraud. And a bunch of other irregularities. I can assure you, I didn't know anything about it. And now I'm trying to find out who did it, and if there's anything I can do about it. Yeah, Nancy sighed. I should probably do something to catalyze my job search. Don't get me wrong, I trust you. But from what you're saying, I don't take offense. Honey, you're absolutely right. You may have to be the one to provide for our family for a while. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, you're not. It's what I envisioned. I understand, honey, but we're a family, and we have to work through things together. You remember for better or for worse. Of course I remember. Charles smiled. But no matter how hard the man tried, he couldn't do it. According to his own apt expression with his bare hands, to stop a snow avalanche, the prosperous business that his family had built for generations collapsed almost in an instant. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Charles never managed to find out who exactly inside the firm was involved in various money frauds. And all the formal strings, of course, led back to him as the business owner. So he was threatened with a considerable prison term under the criminal article. And to avoid this, it was necessary to pay off the numerous debts in which his company was mired. Charles had no choice but to sell the apartment. Nancy told him without a moment's hesitation that since there were no other options, it had to be done as soon as possible. But where would we live? In despair, exclaimed her husband. Where to live? You and I will figure it out, she answered decisively. But what will I do if you go to prison for the rest of your life? I can't even imagine. Here to the rescue of the young family came Molly, who offered her son and daughter-in-law to move to her in the village. My house is a big place. There's enough for everyone, she said. So let's not have any of your objections. You'll be my helpers again. It's a big farm, and I'm not young. I could use an extra hand. And when you get back on your feet, you'll move back to town. If you want to, of course. The young people had no choice but to agree to the proposal. By then, Nancy was long past the point of no work. She hadn't been able to find anything until her belly became too obvious. After that, of course, it would have been foolish to try. No employer would want a pregnant woman, and even late in the pregnancy, on their staff. As for Charles, he came to his senses pretty quickly. He had no time to write. His wife depended on him, their future. The child that was about to be born. A month after the disaster, he found himself a job. Of course, not at the same level as before, as a manager in some small firm. Hopefully, a little more sweat later, looking for something better. I had to go to work, of course, from Molly's village to the city. It wasn't a long way. But that fact couldn't stop Charles. After all, a vegetable garden is a vegetable garden. But you can't eat vegetables alone. And he was simply ashamed to sit on his mother's neck, though she would hardly have minded if he had spent some more time looking for something. Nancy, not wanting to sit idle, actively helped her mother-in-law in the household. Of course, the tasks she was given were not the most difficult, the kind that could not harm her or the future child. She also regularly traveled to the city, despite the long road, which every day became harder to bear. But the woman rightly reasoned that to refuse to see a doctor regularly, even under these conditions, would do more harm than good. Then little Kelly was born. To Nancy's surprise, Molly was in no hurry to take any part in her granddaughter's life. Of course, the woman didn't expect any help from her mother-in-law. After all, she had helped them out enough as it was, so she had every right to rest. After all, she had already canceled her diapers when she was fiddling with little Bones. Nancy was amazed. What Molly was showing to Kelly was complete indifference. Didn't want to play with her, or even just look at the little girl. Of course, she didn't mention it. Not to her mother-in-law, not to her husband. Things happen. Maybe the poor woman was so tired of their presence that she no longer wanted anything. But time went on, and they continued to live in Molly's village house, and neither Charles nor Nancy could find work. For the first 3 years, though, she didn't have time to do it. And time was not playing on her side. Now, in addition to a dubious departure from her previous job, she has a gaping hole in her employment record of almost 5 years. And a small child in her arms did not add to her employer's favor. Charles, on the other hand, remained a simple manager. He could not get a more prestigious position. After all, he was the owner of the company, which had prospered for many years, and under him scandalously ceased to exist. Of course, inside the company where he got a job, his talents were appreciated, but there were simply no opportunities for him to be promoted. Yeah, don't worry, Molly told them. Stay with me as long as you need, for the rest of your life. I know it's a difficult situation, and they're not strangers. They're human beings, and they lived. What else could they do? And, in general, they lived quite well in the fresh air, in a good house with fresh vegetables, grown with their own hands. They had enough money for everything they needed, and the landlady seemed to be only happy to have them in her possession. The only thing that every year more and more worried Nancy was rapidly approaching the time when Kelly would have to go to school. Of course, it was good for a child to live in the fresh air, so to speak, in harmony with nature. But to get up at 5 o'clock and go to the city for a lesson is not very convenient. In the village, there were simply no educational institutions. However, no matter how it was, there was still enough time to think of a way out of this situation. In the meantime, you could live in peace and enjoy your happiness. After all, by and large, everything was fine. She and Charles, as promised to each other on the wedding day. Together overcame a difficult period, and now together entered a joyful and carefree. The trouble came completely out of the blue. They were celebrating Kelly's 4th birthday. As always, just the three of them. Molly, as it always happens, refused to attend the party, referring to some urgent matters. The couple had long ago stopped paying attention to this quirk of hers. She wasn't very young after all, and she was entitled to her little oddities. Right at the party table, Charles began to feel sick. First, he began to breathe heavily, and just a few minutes later, he fell to the floor, grabbing life by the chest. Frightened, Nancy immediately called an ambulance, and the long minutes of waiting dragged on. It was not until 200 hours later that paramedics were able to reach their backwoods home. They looked at Charles and were talking excitedly amongst themselves. They began loading him onto a stretcher. No one paid much attention to Nancy, as if she wasn't even here. The ambulance workers showed some reaction only when she took her daughter in her arms and started to climb into their car. "So, lady, where are you going?" One of them asked sternly. "I'm the wife of your patient, and I'm going to the hospital with my husband." "Oh, okay. But why bring the child with you? What's a little girl gonna do in the ICU? Watch her daddy die." "What do you mean, dying?" "Literally, he's having a heart attack. And it's been too long since the attack. We're gonna do everything we can. But I'm not gonna get your hopes up. He probably won't even make it to the hospital." Nancy froze and didn't realize that the ambulance had already left. The doctor's words just drowned her out. She felt as if she had been hit on the head with a very heavy object. How is it a heart attack? How is that dying? What the hell is this? Aren't there too many deaths around her for that very reason? And how will she live without her Charles? Molly, to her surprise, reacted quite calmly to her son's condition, and even to the words of the doctor, who could hear as well as Nancy. As soon as the car left, she calmly went on with her vegetable garden chores. As if nothing had happened, she just said something in passing. "What can you do? It's hereditary. His father also died early and, alas, of the same disease. You probably know that yourself. But he's your son." Nancy couldn't stand it. "How can you be so calm? Do I have to lie down and die too?" shouted the mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do about it?" "I don't think so. So why worry for nothing?" Nancy, startled by her words, went back into the house. She didn't know what to do, to go into town, but she hadn't even been told which hospital Charles was being taken to. Not that there were very many in their little town, but to run to all of them, and with a baby. I mean, even now, it's unlikely her grandmother would even agree to look after Kelly. It's not the smartest thing to do. But she couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. In the end, all she could do was pace the room, feverishly thinking about what to do, how to help Charles, and how she would live if she couldn't help him. She was unceremoniously interrupted by a phone call, which was probably the 100th time she had thought about it, but had not yielded any results. With trembling hands, Nancy picked up the phone, and before answering it for a while, just stared at it. She had already guessed what she was about to hear, and it was as if she were trying to delay the inevitable, but of course she couldn't delay it for too long. "Hello? Hello? Nancy." "Yes," she answered in a shaky voice. "It's me." "Nancy, you have a call from the 3rd City Hospital. Is it about your husband? I'm authorized to inform you that the doctors did everything possible to resuscitate him. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, your husband passed away. I'm sorry for your loss." Nancy had absolutely no recollection of her time. The next hour, I think she sobbed, rolled around on the floor, and almost banged her head against the walls. And it seemed that her own life had ended along with Charles's, that there was no point in her continuing to be in this world. And there's no telling how long it would have lasted or how it would have ended if it hadn't been for Kelly. Scared, the little girl had absolutely no idea what was going on. They were sitting around, celebrating her birthday, and everything was just fine. And then in an instant, everything fell apart. First, something happened to her dad, and now her mom went crazy. For a long time, she hoped all this madness would just go away. But Mommy kept rolling around on the floor and crying bitterly, and little Kelly had no choice but to join her. The sounds her daughter began to make brought Nancy to her senses rather quickly. She sat down on the floor, not exactly calmly, but at least already quite aware of what she was doing, and pressed Kelly against her, albeit briefly, but still she had forgotten even about her, and now she felt guilty. No, this was her raison d'etre. She may no longer have a husband, but she still had a child she was responsible for. Aha, you've calmed down at last, Molly grumbled. Molly quietly appeared in the room and said to Nancy, I must tell you, Lord, how did Charles die? The woman replied indifferently, Yes, I'm following in your footsteps. I told you I wasn't going to waste my energy worrying about it. Nancy made no reply. She could not understand how one could be so calm about the unexpected death of one's own child. Could it be some kind of defense mechanism? Maybe the mother-in-law had not yet fully realized what had happened. Everyone reacts differently to such shocks. She can't really feel nothing. Oh, by the way, Molly, meanwhile, now that you're awake, let's start packing. What do you mean? I don't get it, Nancy. What do you mean? What? You don't think I'd let a stranger stay in my house, do you? You were my son's wife. I'm nobody, and I don't see any reason to keep you here any longer. This shocked Nancy even more. It was exactly the sort of thing she'd been trying to avoid for the rest of her life, and it was exactly what she had finally arrived at. And all of a sudden it occurred to her that it must be a birth curse or something. Otherwise, how else to explain that now she had to repeat her mother's fate? But let's say I'm a stranger to you. Though all the years we've known each other, I've been sure of the opposite, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Kelly is Kelly. After all, she is your granddaughter, the daughter of your only son, who is no longer alive. And I'd already told you that I don't like children, and I'm not going to take care of them. I don't want your Kelly here. But where are we going? You know very well I have no home, no job, no relatives. Well, my dear, you should have thought of that before. Why should it suddenly become my problem? Nancy didn't know what to say to that. She had already realized that appealing to this woman's candid feelings was an absolutely useless venture. All this time, she had been hiding her true nature behind a mask of benevolence and friendliness. But now the need to pretend was completely gone. She looked at both the woman who had just lost her husband and her daughter, who was her own granddaughter, with a completely blank stare. Well, all right. Molly suddenly softened. We have an old barn on our property. We lived in it when there was no house. It's cramped, of course, but there's a bed and a stove. It's just enough to get by. You can occupy it for now, but don't let me see you in the house. In fact, don't try to see me too often. Thank you, said Nancy. It wasn't much of an option, of course, but it was better than going out on the street with her daughter. Thanks. You won't get fed up, Molly said, considering this shed you're renting from me. Yeah. Don't interrupt. I know you don't have any money. You'll do all the work in the summer, chop wood in the winter. You'll do all the little errands. For that, you can live in the barn and take a small share of the harvest. All right, Nancy agreed. She couldn't see any other way out. It would be easier if she were alone. But she was also responsible for her daughter, so she couldn't just proudly raise her head and walk away into the unknown. So at least the child would be in the relative warmth of safety and nourishment. And so it was that she and her entourage began to live in that very shirt. Nancy thought that the hardest thing to explain to her daughter would be what had happened. Why did they have to move from a spacious house to this squalid one? Where was her father? And why they would never see him again? However, to the woman's surprise, the girl herself started this difficult conversation, showing herself beyond her years, wise and understanding. Mom, she asked, when they were settling into their new place of residence. Dad's dead. We won't see him again. I'm afraid so, Sunshine, Nancy replied. It's just you and me now. Then said the girl seriously, I'm going to take care of you now. Daddy always said that if anything happened to him, I'd have to take care of it." "Ah," dumbfounded, fought Nancy. "How could you know something and not tell me? But you did try to prepare the child somehow." Well, perhaps that was the right thing to do. At first, the woman hoped this existence wouldn't last too long for them. She would get a job, not as a saleswoman, but as a cleaner, and she and her daughter would be able to return to the city, yes, again in some rented room. And what to do? After all, she'd lived like that with her mother, and nothing too bad had happened. However, the more time passed, the more it became clear that it was impossible. Called on her household work took away both time and energy. It became obvious that under such conditions she would not even be able to look for a job. But if not to fulfill the terms of the contract, she and her child would simply end up on the street. A completely hopeless situation. Gradually, Nancy came to terms with the idea of living. This is how they will have a few more years until her daughter grows up a little and will be able to help her in the household. Of course, it would be bad to exploit the child in this way, but it would give her at least a chance to find a job and return to the city. At the same time, the woman began to prepare Kelly for school, although she didn't really see how that would be possible. At the very least, she was ready to teach her herself, although this option seemed to be the worst of all possible. After all, she didn't know as much as she should, and she wanted to give her daughter a better education than she had received, so that at least she would not repeat the unenviable fate of her older relatives. For now, Nancy slowly taught her daughter to read, count, and write. To her surprise and joy, Kelly turned out to be a very imaginative child and grasped everything literally on the fly. By the time she was 5, she was already able to read syllables and print letters and do simple math calculations. The latter, it seems, was very fascinating to the girl herself. So a little over a year passed. Nancy was still trying to make some plans to return to normal life, but every day they seemed less and less realistic. She was beginning to think that there was no way out of the vicious circle in which she and her daughter found themselves. But help found them, coming from a direction from which no one could expect it. It was shortly after Kelly's birthday. It was late at night, and the girl had long been sleeping peacefully in her bed. Only Nancy had no time for sleep. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, she looked at the photograph of her late husband and cried softly so as not to wake her daughter. From the moment they had been forced to live in that barn, it had become a kind of daily routine for her. More accurately, a nightly ritual. During the day, she had to be strong, had to work, and take care of her daughter. She had no time to grieve for Charles. But at night, she could afford to grieve enough. And on one such night, something strange came to Nancy's sensitive ears, like the creaking of a new wicket gate, not somewhere far away, but on their property. It alarmed the woman. She knew for a fact that Molly never went out at this hour, and she never had visitors. So what was it? Did thieves break in? The landlady must have heard the sound too. There was an answering creak from the side of the house. Then a loud yell from Molly, wondering who it was that was walking and what they wanted on her property. She was answered by another voice that sounded vaguely familiar to Nancy. What exactly he said the woman did not hear, but it clearly did not please her mother-in-law, who delivered a rather long and vehement monologue. The second voice answered her with no less emotional phrase. A verbal altercation ensued. Nancy sat behind Merzav, not knowing what to do, whether to go out and try to figure out what was going on, or, on the contrary, to sit quietly and keep her head down. In any case, whatever was going on outside, it looked little like a robbery or any other criminal act. It didn't make it any clearer, however, whether the acoustics in the barn made it worthwhile to intervene in the unfolding conflict. Nancy couldn't even begin to understand what it was about. While she was thinking, however, the problem resolved itself. There was the creak of the door again, this time very close. Someone had entered her barn, and she had no time to realize it. When in the faint light of the lamp she saw a face, Nancy stared and could not believe her eyes. Standing on the threshold of her humble abode was an elderly woman she recognized without a doubt, though she hadn't seen her in years. Now it was clear why the voice of the uninvited guests seemed so familiar to her. Of course it did. She had heard it more than once or twice, and it was with such cruel and accusing intonations. "Grandmother." It was all she could manage to say before she fainted. Woke up. Nancy was still in the same barn, and she didn't even immediately remember what exactly had happened. It seemed to her that she had simply not noticed how she had fallen asleep, sitting habitually on the bed with a picture of her late husband. Soon enough, however, her memory brought back the image of her grandmother standing in the doorway of her home. However, and this she took for the first minute to be either a dream or a play of her sick imagination. But as soon as she turned her head slightly, it became clear that everything that had happened was real. Her grandmother was sitting on the next bed, holding little Kelly, who was her great-granddaughter. She was talking affectionately to the girl about something, and the girl, not expressing any sign of fright, was telling her passionately about something. Nancy provoked the grandmother, noticing the stirring on the neighboring bed. Woke up. "Oh, that's good. See, Kelly, Mommy's okay. Were you scared?" "She had every reason to be," replied Nancy coldly. "Daughter, didn't I tell you not to talk to strangers?" "But Lisa said she wasn't a stranger," the girl retorted. Nancy stared at her dumbfounded at first, and then laughed half at the ridiculousness of the situation, half letting out her nervous tension. Still, she sometimes forgot that her daughter was beyond bright. But she was still a 5-year-old child with all the consequences of this fact. "And what bomb not from us?" she asked. "Calm down. Nancy, I realize that you have every reason to be both angry with me and distrustful of me. However, you have to realize that I changed." "No, I guess I haven't. That's not even the point. I haven't changed. It's the circumstances. And now I really want to make it up to you. You don't know me at all. And neither do I. The last time I saw you, I was the same age as Veda is now. Then I remember you called me that and wanted nothing to do with me." "That's true?" Kelly asked sternly, glancing at her great-grandmother. "I'm afraid so, penitent sunshine," replied the latter. "Then don't do it again," said the girl. "I won't." "My good," Lisa said. "How did you even know where to find me, by the way?" asked Nancy. "Well, it wasn't too hard, I suppose. I'm a relative after all, so I was very willing to share information. You were married to a well-known businessman in town. They wrote about you in the newspapers about how he went bankrupt, sold his apartment, and went to his mother's house in the country. I asked around your former neighbors. That's how I found out what kind of village it was. But here, too, you had to go around a few houses in the middle of the night." Nancy clarified skeptically. "Yes, they weren't happy about it, but they pointed out the right house in the end. I had planned to arrive at a more appropriate time, but I didn't expect the road to be so terrible. I don't like driving anyway. I had to go at the speed of a bicycle on your off-road course." "So you're driving a car?" Nancy was amazed. "Not on foot," grumbled Lisa. "You wouldn't be able to get here otherwise. At my age. And I'm still quite capable of driving." "Well, let's say you are." Nancy sighed heavily. "So why did you come anyway? What had to happen for you to suddenly remember I existed?" "I came to see how you were doing. I didn't expect it to be this bad. I guess you've had a bad luck with your mother-in-law, just like your poor mother." "Oh my God. It's exactly the same situation. It's exactly the same. So now I think you and Kelly should get out of here. You shouldn't have to live in such an abominable environment. Why would you care?" Nancy couldn't take it anymore, so she raised her voice. "You said yourself that my mother had the same situation with you that I did. You hated her as much as you hated me. Did you have a guilty conscience in your old age?" Quietly, Lisa whispered angrily, "Kelly's asleep. No wonder. There's no time. I'll explain it to you in a minute, and it has nothing to do with conscience, believe me. At least not my poem," to Nancy's skeptical eye. She took a deep breath and corrected herself. No, of course I'm guilty before you. And whatever your mother's sins, real or imaginary, you're not responsible for her. Besides, she really is my own granddaughter. After my son died, I had no one else. And I treated you like this. What sins of my mother's are you talking about? Nancy was indignant. As far as I know, she tried to find a common language with you to the very last. It was you who disliked her from the very first time you met her. She didn't seem to me to be a good match for my son, Lisa confessed. But I think I could have accepted her in time, but I didn't have the chance to get to know her better. I must have missed that first impression. Since I could so easily believe all the anonymity with which she was smitten, Nancy asked. Yes, different people have sent me notes of pictures that say, "Your mother is cheating on my son," and then that it's not really his daughter. They wrote that she was with him only because of her apartment, then she didn't have one, and then even worse, as if she had deliberately decided to kill him, so that everything he had would remain only for her. That's when I persuaded him to sign the apartment over to me. Like if something really happened to him so she wouldn't get it, and he agreed. I was sure nothing was going to happen to him anytime soon. And then, as you know, he died young. He had a heart attack, you know. It must have been so hard for me to believe. And then, after all those letters, I thought it was a sure thing. Your mother poisoned my son. And you believed it. Then I did. I'm telling you, I really didn't like her at first. Now, though, I realize it wasn't even her. It was me. I was too attached to my only child. Like I didn't want to share him with anyone, you know. How can you not believe something that so clearly confirms his own beliefs? Well, dumbfounded, Nancy retorted. But now what made you change your mind after all these years? Yes, you see, conscience. Not me, really, but the girl who wrote the notes. She's not a girl now. She's a grown woman, the same age as your mother-in-law and mother. If she were alive, she would have come to me and told me that she had written those letters and that there was not a word of truth in them. She made them up out of her head, and she'd forged the photos somehow. All because she was your father's girlfriend before he met your mom. She loved him madly and couldn't get over the breakup. I don't know what went wrong between them. All I know is that your mom had nothing to do with it. They met a little later. But this girl was literally obsessed with your dad. She was watching him. And of course, when she found out he had a new love, she hated her. But I didn't do anything about it at first. I hoped it wouldn't work out, or that he'd remember. She'd leave your mother, and everything would be fine. But when they decided to get married, that's when, you know, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to act secretly through me. That's the story. Nancy exhaled. But I'm sorry. I don't think it justifies you. You have to believe someone you don't know, and literally ruin a person's life for it. I'm not talking about me. But my mom died young, and my dad died because she thought he was torn between the two of you. Yes, Nancy. Lisa sighed again. You're right. I realize that now. But you can't undo what you've done. And you can't get your parents back. But I can at least try to help you and your little girl. You're the only family I have left. What do you suggest? What do you mean? What? Come back to the city with me to your parents' apartment. I've been renting it out all this time, but it's empty now. You can live there, especially since it's rightfully yours. I'm even willing to officially sign it over to you, and I'll help you with money for a while. I've got a lot of money saved up over a long life, but they haven't brought me any happiness. Well, I don't know. Nancy stretched out. In her soul, she was struggling with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, the offer looked just fine. Really, the apartment should logically belong to her. And Kelly would be much better off living there. Honestly, she'd probably be better off anywhere than here. Lisa's visit to Nancy was supposed to be her salvation from all her misfortunes. On the other hand, she saw before her not so much an unhappy old and lonely woman as a man who had ruined her whole life, and though indirectly had caused the death of her mother, and perhaps even of her father. It was simply repugnant to accept any help from her, no matter how much she assured her granddaughter of her sincere remorse. There was, however, another consideration that was not at all pleasant. There was not the slightest reason to trust the grandmother who had suddenly announced herself. She might be up to some other mischief. It wasn't very likely, of course, but I couldn't put it out of my mind. I can understand your reluctance to accept anything from me, Lisa said. But think of your daughter. She'll be going to school soon. How's she gonna get here every day? I'm sorry, Nancy, but this couldn't have come at a better time. Believe me, I'm speaking and acting from the heart. No strings attached. Take it, granddaughter. Nancy looked carefully straight into Lisa's eyes and suddenly realized, even for herself, that she believed her. Some inner instinct told her that the old woman was telling the truth and really wanted to help, or to ease her own soul before her imminent death. After all, at her age, you really don't know which day might be your last. Okay, Nancy stretched out. Here's the thing. The morning is wiser in the evening. Come on, let's get to bed. It's getting late. We don't have much room, but I can go with Kelly. Why don't you guys come over here on my bed? We'll figure out what we're gonna do in the morning. You're not going anywhere right now anyway. Lisa agreed. The next morning they hurriedly packed their things, to Molly's indignant cries. It seemed that the woman had gotten so used to having a free labor that she didn't want to let her go. But alas, there was no real possibility of keeping the woman at her place. On entering the apartment where she had been born and had spent the first years of her life, Nancy experienced mixed feelings. The atmosphere was exactly the same as it had been under her parents, and this novella is a memory of those childhood years, which were still happy. A dad and mom still alive, and how good they all were until everything went downhill. Kelly, who had never seen a city or her own apartment in her life, loved it here. She was genuinely amazed by the simplest things. Hot water giving straight from the faucet to go to the toilet right in the house warmth, without the need to make firewood and stoke the stove. In addition, the girl now had her own desk, where she could both draw and study. Undoubtedly, it was much more comfortable than sitting on the bed, putting under a notebook or album sheet of some kind, and even great-grandmother, having learned about her interest in math, gave her a children's book with many entertaining and puzzle problems. So Kelly was perfectly happy. And Nancy, to be frank, was glad to be back in town, and would have been glad even if the last terrible year had simply not existed. Fresh air was fresh, and yes, and her own vegetables were certainly a good thing. Still, she missed the conveniences of the city, and the stores, and the noisy streets, and all the other hustle and bustle that had no place in the village under any guise. Sometimes it began to seem to Nancy that Lisa had become a real guardian angel to her and little Kelly. Only a month after returning to the city, the woman managed to find a job, and it was as a sales consultant in a clothing store, with a very good salary. And her life slowly began to return to normal. In addition, quite quickly, Nancy became convinced that she could leave Kelly with her grandmother without any fears. The latter did not dote on her great-granddaughter. Or maybe she just spent too much time alone, and she was glad of any company, and at the same time the object of care. And the girl herself became fast friends with Lisa. Nancy's relations with her grandmother were still strained. Whatever she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could not win her granddaughter's favor. The woman herself was not happy about this state of affairs, but she could not help it. The resentment was too strong. The damage done was too great. The only thing she had the nobility to do was not to turn Kelly against Lisa and not to prevent their communication. However, she would not let her grandmother even on the doorstep of her apartment, and brought her daughter to her. And one day there came a moment when they all rejoiced at this behavior of hers. One day, returning from work, Nancy gathered the entourage from Lisa, and they went home together. Barely putting the key in the keyhole, the woman realized something was wrong. The door was not locked, only slightly covered, and not very neatly at that. Nancy knew for a fact that she could not have left it in this condition. She always checked all sorts of things thoroughly before she left, including coming back several times almost halfway across the street to make sure the apartment was perfectly safe. Inside, however, it was chaos. All the drawers were overturned, things from the closets unceremoniously thrown on the floor, even the beds. Even the beds were a horrifying sight. The linens had been stripped from them, and the mattresses had clearly been exposed to some kind of cutting object. It was obvious at a glance that something had been searched, very thoroughly and meticulously. Of course, the first thing Nancy did was to call the police. The law enforcers arrived and carefully examined the crime scene, but did not seem to be able to find any significant clues. They then invited the homeowner to take a look at her belongings and tell them what was missing. That's where the strangest and most frightening thing came to light. Nothing was missing. Not that there were a lot of valuable things in the house, but still potential thieves would have something to gain. However, and silver jewelry, Nancy, and TV, and a laptop, bought for study, found here in the apartment, albeit not in their places, so the perpetrators were not the target. Robbery, concluded one of the police officers. Unless, of course, you had, for example, some documents or other things that might be of interest to a particular person and were not in this apartment. There is nothing like that, Nancy said, confused. Look, I work as a store clerk, and you're implying that my house might contain dangerous dirt. You're a store clerk now, the cop said. You used to be the wife of a prominent businessman. As far as I know, I'm not implying anything, but I had to ask you this question anyway. All right, if you are firmly convinced that nothing of the sort could have been looked for here, I'm sure, immediately, replied Nancy. Good. Then another theory. Maybe you just wanted revenge for something. Do you have any enemies? Maybe someone who has a reason to hold a grudge against you. Unless it's an ex-mother-in-law, Nancy chuckled. But I don't think the old woman would have come all the way from the country to trash my apartment. You know, I've seen so many interesting situations over the years that I wouldn't be surprised if she had. Anyway, until we find out who did this, I wouldn't advise you to stay in this apartment. But where am I going to go? Nancy was indignant. Well, you know, that's not a question for me. The policeman shrugged his shoulders. But since this isn't a robbery, it could be personal. Not a sure thing, of course. But still, it's up to you. But it might not be safe here. After some thought, Nancy decided that it would be better for Kelly to stay with Lisa for a while. She couldn't bring herself to move in with her, even for a while. Even though she didn't mind at all. Even the possible threat to her life did not frighten her, as the prospect of being under the same roof with her own grandmother for a long time. So they lived for another 2 or 3 weeks. The police promised to call as soon as they knew something, but they never heard from them again. Fortunately, there were no new frightening incidents either. Nancy was even beginning to think that if all was quiet, she might as well take her daughter back home. Sure, she came to see her every day, but she still couldn't be completely calm when Kelly wasn't home at night. After all, if suddenly someone was actually looking for some specific documents, assuming Nancy might have them, what was to stop them from breaking into Lisa's place? For example, figuring she might have hidden them at her grandmother's. And to Nancy's surprise, it turned out soon enough that she wasn't too far from the truth. The compromise that was apparently being sought in their apartment was not even Lisa's, but Kelly's, who, of course, had no idea about it. And it turned out at the moment when, among her notebooks, brought from the village, the girl found a memory card. The kind that are usually inserted into cell phones. Fortunately, she didn't throw it away or try to look at the information it contained. Instead, she showed it to Lisa. The woman, after a moment's hesitation, contacted Nancy. An hour later, the woman was driving home with the memory card in her purse. Some premonition told her that it was this small black rectangle that had caused the mayhem in her apartment. Before she reported her find to the police, however, she decided it was worth taking a look at its contents for herself. What if there is some innocent video of a corporate party? Or an archive of photos of her beloved dead cat Molly? Or maybe the card was empty? Strictly speaking, Nancy had expected to see absolutely anything, up to and including a detailed videotape of some horrible crime being committed. But she wasn't prepared for what was actually on the memory card. After a quick look through all the files, she rushed to call the police again. After listening to her, the officer on duty assured her that he would send officers immediately. However, they had to go not to Nancy's house, but to the village where Molly lived. Besides the fact that the police now had evidence that she had committed a serious crime, they also had every reason to fear for her own life, and they were just in time. When they pulled up, some suspicious type had already finished pouring gasoline on it and was now about to set it on fire with the landlady, sleeping peacefully inside. A few days later, one of the policemen arrived at Nancy's house, where little Kelly had already returned. As it turned out, it was the same one who had arrived on her first call. Now, however, he had an extra star on each of his epaulets. Here, he said, right from the doorstep, he came to express his official gratitude to you. Thanks to you, we have caught an extremely dangerous gang, which we have been hunting for decades and unofficially. What was that for? Because again, thanks to you, I was in charge of the operation. And as you may have noticed, I got an additional rank for it. No way. It's basically a pure coincidence. What does that have to do with me? Maybe so, but still, what if it wasn't an accident? Oh, come on. Anyway, I think you'd like to know some details about this case. I can help you with that. Of course, it's within the limits of what I can tell you not to harm the investigation. But it just so happens that I already know some things, Nancy remarked. For instance, that it was my mother-in-law who killed her husband, and then mine, in conspiracy with some bandits. I didn't quite understand why it took her so long to do it, though. Slow-acting poison, the policeman explained. But a very trustworthy man dies of what looks like a heart attack. There's no way to trace it. The substance is eliminated from the body very quickly, virtually undetectable. If it wasn't for this tape, we'd never know the truth. That's right. Why would she keep it in the barn where she sent me and my daughter to live? I mean, any one of us could have accidentally found it, which is exactly what happened. Well, she kept it as protection from her own accomplices. She couldn't have survived this long without it. They tried to kill her right after they found out she didn't have it. Yeah, it was stupid of her to report them missing. Panicked. Besides, she had no other options. Someone to send to your apartment to try and find her. Although you're right, it would have been better for her to stay put either way, having discovered it missing. If it hadn't been for the mayhem in your apartment, you might not have even noticed that memory card. And as for your second question, she didn't keep it hidden in some old notebook. And then, when she gave it to your daughter, she mixed it up, discovered it. By the way, right on the day you left her, but never found a way to discreetly change the notebooks back. So that's what she was so excited about that day, Nancy realized. Well, that much is clear, but the rest is still a mystery to me. What kind of person would kill their own son? What could possibly be the reasons for such an act? But first of all, Charles was not her son. Yeah, don't look so surprised. In fact, he probably didn't even know it himself. His real mother died when he was very young, and his father took Molly in, first as a nanny for the boy, and then married her. As I recall, your husband was assured all his adult life that this woman was his real mother, but even so, I still don't understand. She raised him, fed him, educated him, was so nice to him. You know, I honestly don't get it either. Well, on an emotional level, I guess her hatred for his whole family was too great. Well, that's just gonna confuse the two of us. Let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. You're right, Nancy nodded. That would be most convenient. Well then, it all began, perhaps, when Molly was not even alive. But there was her father, a young but promising businessman who shared everything with an old school friend. As you may have guessed, with the father of her future husband. These two, as far as I understood, were inseparable since childhood, went to the same group of kindergarten, then got into the same class. They went to university together in high school. They graduated together and started a small business together. Their business prospered. However, at some point one of the partners began to notice some oddities, that somewhere the balance does not add up, or something else. At first it was small things, but then the violations became more and more serious. It was already becoming dangerous for the whole business, and the owner could not find the one who was to blame. He had already checked the accountant and all the staff, even those who, it would seem, could not have access to such serious things. There's no way to appeal to the competent authorities. Naturally, he didn't want to, so as not to incur suspicion on himself. In general, as I understand it, he was going to quietly, without making a fuss, fire the culprit of all these problems, somehow deal with the violations, and quietly move on with his life. However, the further he dug, the more he realized that only one person could do such a thing: his business partner, and consequently, Molly's father. She herself was still in high school at the time. Of course, the owner of the firm for a long time did not want to believe it, but eventually realized that the evidence is irrefutable. Then he came to his friend with a business proposition. He fixes everything he has done, returns the stolen money, and voluntarily leaves the firm. For what reasons? Let him think of his own. But from that moment their paths diverge, and they have no further dealings with each other. It would seem to be an ideal option for a dishonest partner. But he blows up, saying it's as much my business as it is yours. And since that's how you feel about me, why don't you and I just split it fair and square? We built it together, and now you'll get all the good stuff. Anyway, they couldn't reach a peaceful agreement. And then the honest partner went to the police and ratted out Molly's dad. He ended up keeping the business, although he had to sweat a lot to bring it back to its former level of development. And his friend went to prison, and for a long time. He died for a long time, born with some not too pleasant disease. His wife could not bear the loss of her husband, and soon followed him, and their 15-year-old daughter went to an orphanage. It is clear that she started a grudge, considering her father's former friend to be to blame for all her troubles. She didn't manage to get a proper education, nothing at all. All her parents' property was sold off for their debts. The only thing left was a plot of land in the village, which their family used to use as a summer house, and even that played against Molly, so that she could count on at least some apartment from the state. But with this plot and house, it turned out that even this she is not entitled to, because any but housing she has. In general, she left the orphanage angry at the whole world, but most of all at her father's old friend. Lived in the village, interrupted by casual earnings, until one day she saw an ad in the newspaper that a little boy who had lost his mother needed a nanny. Of course, she had no desire to sit with the infant, but when she saw the name of the employer, she realized this was her chance for revenge. She had a lot of patience, and she waited first for the wedding, and then for the boy to grow up, and a little into the management of the business, so that when his father died, the business would definitely go to him and not to someone else. But why go to all this trouble? Nancy wondered. Up to this moment she had served with bated breath. Yes, because she would hardly have been able to ruin the business with her husband alive. And that's exactly what she wanted. I think murder just seemed too small for her. Not enough to satisfy her thirst for revenge. She wanted someone from her abuser's family to experience the hardships she had to endure. So she's the one who ruined the suit, the business. Yeah, well, I'd have to say you were her unwitting accomplice. Charles was very attracted to you, and therefore began to pay less time to work affairs, and then even left for a month on a wedding trip, which gave her full freedom of action. But that was later. First, she took out his father. In fact, that's where the gang shows up in the story. What were we so successful in picking up the other day? We haven't figured out exactly how she got in touch with these people, but they gave her a way to commit the crime, and they sold her the poison. That was their primary function. Let's say Nancy wrinkles her brow, but I still don't get it. She ruined the business. We had to sell the apartment and move in with her. You'd think that's what she was after. Why kill Charles too? It was her plan to destroy the whole family. Besides, she couldn't have been too pleased to have you living in her house, and there was no way to evict you while he was alive. He could have tried to start a new business. He might have succeeded. And then everything would have been ruined. All her plans and her hopes. Nancy, are you all right? The woman gasped, covered her mouth with her hand. My back was against the wall I was standing against. The policeman helped her to the couch and sat down, poured water, and only after drinking it was she able to speak. You said she wanted to destroy the whole family. Then I'm afraid she did. She didn't put you in the barn out of some twisted pity. She targeted your daughter, the last member of a hated family, as her next victim. Who knows what would have happened if your grandmother had been so fortunate as not to remember your existence. Yes, Nancy muttered, and now everything was falling into place. Well, thank you very much for the information. I'm not sure I needed it so badly, though. Well, philosophized the policeman. It would have come to you sooner or later anyway. After all, if you didn't know the details, you'd look for them and you'd still hear them at the trial. He left, and Nancy spent a long time trying to come to her senses and digest what she had just learned. She thought of the incredible twists and turns she could make in life. And now it turned out that her kind and cheerful mother-in-law turned out to be a real monster. And her grandmother, who she'd spent her whole life thinking was the worst person in the world. Turns out she saved her daughter, even if she didn't know it. The thought turned Nancy's mind upside down. She realized that she no longer felt the disgust she had for Lena. Only now did she truly feel grateful to her for pulling her and Kelly out of the nightmare they had lived in for a year. The very next day, she showed up at her grandmother's house with flowers and a cake. The women talked for a long time and cried a lot. In the end, they sat up so late that Nancy and Kelly had to spend the night at Lisa's house, and for the first time, the thought didn't cause her granddaughter's soul any repulsion. The following year, Kelly went to school. Not an easy one. Lisa hustled to get her accepted into a math grammar school. There her abilities quickly appreciated at face value and began to prophesize her great future. The girl studied very well. And no one was surprised by the fact that after 11 years, she decided to leave to enter one of the prestigious universities in the capital. True, Lisa, who was one of the first to notice the talent of her great-granddaughter, did not live to see this happy moment. She passed away shortly after Kelly went to the first grade, after spending very little time with her newfound family again. This came as a major blow to Nancy, although in her mind, she knew it was coming. I'd lived a good life, Lisa said shortly before she died. And at the end of it, I managed to do some real good. What are you saying, Grandma? Nancy was outraged at the time. At what end do you have to send your branch to university and then get married? Oh, my dear, I don't think I'll have time to marry you either, let alone a branch. But it's okay. Don't get upset. I'm already very old, and I'm really glad that I'll die knowing that I've received your forgiveness. The old woman's words proved prophetic. Nancy had indeed remarried, but Nana was indeed not destined to see it. The meeting with her second spouse took place a few years after she was buried. Surprisingly, it happened almost exactly the same way as the first time. A man whose car ran into the store where Nancy worked for new pants. He wasn't a businessman though, just a delivery man. And the store was no longer a boutique, but a cheap establishment. Why do you need new pants? Nancy wondered, listening to his confused explanation. How am I going to show up like this to a customer? He wondered. It's at least a fine. And if it turns out to be very scandalous, so and even dismissal, it's not a big stain. Smirked the woman with hysteria in the toilet on the second floor. That's all. That's what he did. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the store again. It was Nancy's shift. Don't tell me. Half joking, half wary, she said, that now you've spilled coffee on your jacket. Honestly, that was the idea. The man smirked, but I decided to dispense with those cheap excuses. The thing is, I really like you. Let me ask you out on a date. My name is Charles, by the way. At this point, the woman almost fainted. For the second time in her life, but she did go on a date. This time, the relationship had no negative impact on her work. In addition, the new suitor was approved by the most important censor, Lisa, so 6 months later they got married. A year later, Nancy's daughter had a baby brother.
Subscribe and click the bell.
She's so uncomplicated. Ethan smiled, and his smile was surprisingly gentle and dreamy. Who? John wondered. They were in a nightclub, but the loud music didn't stop them from talking. Separate rooms with excellent noise insulation were provided for solvent clients. The guys were not just solvent clients, but also regular and very generous with tips. Therefore, this small but very cozy office with panoramic windows and a mirror ceiling was, you could say, assigned to them. So who's the uncomplicated one? Ethan snapped out of his dreamy reverie and for some reason whispered, Slaga, she is such a... Listen, I honestly haven't met anyone like her. Her father owns a tire shop, a businessman, a hard worker, and the girl is not spoiled by life at all. I asked her where she likes to vacation. So she told me, you know what she said? You won't believe it. She says that at the cottage father says fishing, and they then from this fish caught, food cooked, fry it, and with boiled potatoes eat and soup still. Liar. John stared at me. You're a fool. She's playing a joke on you, and you believe it. What kind of girl would have fun like that, as if she's already retired? That's ridiculous. No, wait, I see what's going on. Where's their summer house? Did you ask? Maybe in Cyprus, maybe. No. It's just a little tree, 40 miles out of town, inherited from my grandparents. And that's where he and his daddy have their place of power. They go fishing, pick mushrooms, berries. Listen, she can make jam, and she dries mushrooms and pickles them. What a great girl! She says she starts her mornings with exercise and douses herself with cold water to avoid getting sick. No, but have you ever seen such girls? Not in the movies, but for real. Everybody else has a fitness center and a personal trainer and a healthy diet, and she's exercising in cold water. Aha! And fried fish and chips, plus jam. You're looking for exotic, aren't you? John asked me glumly. I don't even want to ask where you found it, but I'll advise you as a friend. Get rid of her before it's too late. You don't know these country girls, and they're clutching, she'll grab you and that's it. You won't realize how married you'll be, and then you won't get divorced. She'll grab everything she can reach, and you'll be left without pants. Oh, come on, don't make me sad. Ethan grinned. You haven't seen her, Clara. She's like a Cinderella, friendly, kind, and good at everything. Her eyes are like this, and all the time she seems to be surprised. I'll order her a coffee and a cake, and she'll have a happy look on her face. At the Moody's, take her hand in the dark, and she is already shining all over. And when I kissed her for the first time, I think she then even the whole night could not sleep. Nay, she's so cute and sweet, you could fall in love with her. Did you fall in love? No. Ethan wrinkled his nose and looked like a hedgehog about to sneeze, but then changed his mind. What kind of love? I've been with so many girls, I don't think I'm capable of falling in love anymore. You remember Thumbelina, don't you? I got bored beforehand. That's 100% me. And the girl? What about the girl? Well, beautiful but funny, but you'll meet another, even prettier, even funnier. If you fall in love with every girl, you won't have enough days in your life. John suddenly winked conspiratorially at his buddy. Listen, doesn't she have a girlfriend? Because you tell me so deliciously, I even thought I might be missing something in life. Jam, for example. You look for it," Ethan said arrogantly and burst out laughing. "Come on, don't be so slow. Go to any cheaper club. There are 100 of them per square meter, and all hungry. You'll treat them to a cocktail and take them to your place." John remained silent, and Ethan suddenly felt sickened by his own cynicism. Ethan had been living in a sticky jam for a month now. It had started out so nice, so funny. Clara, in her colored sundresses, with her long hair and perpetually surprised look, her willingness to admire everything he said, to rejoice at any, even the cheapest gift. Ethan sometimes bought the girl the cheapest chocolates on purpose, just to test her reaction, but she was as happy about them as if she'd been given diamonds. She was so sweetly embarrassed and always asked him to turn off the lights. Every day she wished him a good morning. Yes, everything was so light, funny, plush, like a video clip of a couple in love releasing into the sky, balloons, hearts, and then, holding hands, going to an ice cream parlor. And then it happened, and I had to thrash around, twist and turn, come up with original moves, lie. Lying was the most painful of all. Ethan was more and more confused, with no idea how to get out of the horror that had come over him and pinned him to the ground. The horror looked exactly like the two purple stripes, parallel to each other, on a pregnancy test. It was the test that the idiotic Clara had presented to him by calling and scheduling an urgent appointment. "Come right now, please," she asked. "I have such news. In short, come." "What's wrong?" he asked, surprised. "Have the aliens taken over the planet?" "Ethan, this is not a phone call. Come quickly. It's very important. I'm waiting for you." The girl didn't bother to explain. Ethan was very worried then. The demand, the urgency. It was something out of Clara's repertoire if she said it was urgent. Intuition, of course, was not dormant. Ethan suddenly remembered how, a couple weeks ago, he and Clara had decided to go out of town to a wild beach and had had a wonderful time there until late in the evening. They didn't even want to leave, and she fell in love with the place and kept repeating, "I will live here. I like it here so much that I want to stay here forever." Ethan understood her, he wanted to, but he wanted it to be like this. Warm but not hot weather, the water glistening, and for Clara to walk around in her bathing suit, and for them to be as old as they are today, 18 and 19. He would build a shawl then, right here on top of the hill, and in the evenings they would burn fires and drink cheap sweet wine. A picture to remember. He said out loud, "What is it?" "I want to say that I will remember this day and keep it in detail, like a photograph of you and me living here all our lives and not growing old for a minute. It's like a snapshot, only not with a camera, just with your eyes." He kept in his memory this picture of eternal summer and eternal happiness. However, there were no pharmacies nearby, but Ethan somehow hoped that it would be lucky. And if he hoped in vain, oh, not for good. All this urgency. Oh, not good. What if the wild beach left them a mark in the form off? What the hell is this? Maybe Clara just saw a cockroach and now he's afraid to move, or a mouse. He didn't notice how he accelerated his steps towards the girl's house. Whatever happened there, it was better to find out as soon as possible and not to be tormented by doubts. And maybe it would turn out that there was nothing to worry about. Maybe the girl just needs some help. You know, like move a couch. A couch would be nice. He ran up the stairs to find out, finally, what was the cause of Clara's anxiety. Here is already her floor. Ethan didn't even have time to ring the doorbell. But Slaga jumped out into the entryway in a bathrobe, clutching in her fist a strip of paper with 2 dashes on it. Ethan tried hard not to think about where the test had been before it was picked up. "Look, look!" the girl shrieked, smiling so contentedly that Ethan immediately wanted to run away. Of course, Clara, with her usual stupidity, didn't notice anything and kept shoving the object of her idiotic pride under his nose. Well, what to do now? I wonder what kind of reaction she expects. That he, too, would jump with delight, pick her up in his arms and start twirling her around? Or fall to his knees and start kissing her still flat belly like in the movies? Yeah, a bad movie. "Ethan, what's wrong with you?" "Is that your face? You're not happy." She finally figured it out. "I should be happy. But are you happy? It's our baby, yours and mine. Isn't it great?" "Yours is." Ethan blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. But as for me, that's a moot point. He knew he was saying a nasty, insulting thing. He knew that Clara didn't deserve them, but he was saying them, and now, at this very moment, he wanted them to be true. "How do I know? Maybe I wasn't your only one. You didn't swear fidelity to me, did you? Maybe you were seeing someone else at the same time. I wouldn't be surprised at all." "How? How? Why?" Because. Do you have proof that you didn't go out with someone else, that you only went out with me? No? Well, I don't have any proof either. So why should I believe you? The girl's huge eyes instantly filled with tears. "Ethan, look, there's 2 stripes, that means." "I know what it means without you telling me." "It's okay, it happens. But what does that have to do with me?" "Who else?" "Ethan, what's wrong with you?" "I'm not with anyone else." "Here's a test, check it out." "Don't give me that test. I've seen it. I'm not interested in what it says, Ethan," he asked, squeamishly pulling away. "Well, where? Show me." Clara slammed her eyes shut resentfully. A crystal tear ran down her rounded cheek, her eyes large, open, amber-colored. At first, they seemed childishly enthusiastic and naive. Where had it all gone? It was as if the enchantment had dissipated in an instant, leaving only the surprise of his own blindness. Where was he looking before? Naivety, delight. Now he realized it was not enthusiasm, but elementary stupidity. Too bad it was too late for him. "I had no one else." The girl whispered in a trembling voice. "You know you haven't." "How would I know that?" Ethan started up. "Do you think I've been following you? I mean, who else could have been involved? I'm just saying. You go to the doctor for an abortion. If there's anything there, you have to pay. Fine, I'll pay. But then we break up because I don't want to do it again. Especially from a girl I've never been sure of. You'll get pregnant again, and then you'll want to pin it on me. No way." To the doctor, there was a voice from behind the door. "She's going to register, to observe the pregnancy." "Who the hell is that?" The boy was confused. The door of the apartment opened, and Ethan saw a man in old sweatpants on the doorstep. Apparently, this character was the future grandfather of the 2 stripes and the daddy of the dopey, blissful one. In addition to the pants, the man was dressed in a shedding T-shirt, which favorably emphasized his emerging potbelly. His vast baldness was a strange contrast to his thick, dark mustache. His gaze was ferocious, a real monster. "Good evening, young man." The monster said hello politely and without any transition, grabbed Ethan by the shirt on his chest and pulled him closer. "It's going to kill him." The boy thought and squeezed his eyes shut just in case. "Definitely will. My name is Christopher." The monster growled, breathing in the guy's face. His breath smelled of fish and something else alcoholic. Beer, probably. "Ethan," the boy wheezed. The shirt on his chest pulled taut and rattled threateningly. "Nice to meet you," continued the monster who called himself Christopher, continuing the conversation. "As you may have already guessed, I am Clara's father. Before you say anything in your defense, I feel it is my duty to inform you that I will not tolerate rudeness." This almost refined politeness, combined with the creepy paw rubbing his shirt and the horrifying face in close proximity to Ethan's face, had a paralyzing effect. The guy didn't dare open his eyes, and he didn't even think about trying to break free. "If you hurt her, you hurt me, and it's dangerous to hurt me," growled the monster. "And now a second warning. You will marry my daughter, because my grandson must be born in a legal marriage. Maybe you have not yet had time to propose marriage, Clara, as befits a decent man. Well, now is the time to do it now. That's what you were going to do, like a real man, not a trashy little bastard, right? Am I right? Am I right?" With each new phrase, the monster shook the guy vigorously. "You're right. Yes, yes, of course. That's a smart boy." Christopher, unclasping at last his mighty hand, carefully smoothed Ethan's shirt and patting him paternally on the cheek. "Because if you had been a shameless scoundrel, capable of abandoning a pregnant woman, I would have made a cutlet of you and fed you to my dog. And now I dare not disturb you anymore." The monster smiled and disappeared behind the door. Ethan slid along the wall and sat down on the floor. "Is your father crazy?" he asked. "Or does he always act like that? Or only with guests?" The girl glanced at the door and pressed her finger to her lips. "Speak quietly." "Daddy's hearing is phenomenal. He can hear everything through 3 doors. You'd better be quiet. We're getting married then." Ethan mumbled and covered his face with his hands. It's a nightmare. It was impossible to believe what was happening. The next day, Christopher personally drove the couple to the marriage ceremony and made sure that the applications were written in the proper form and accepted as they should be. At the same time, he kept glancing at Ethan as if he expected the groom to run away or act crazy. "Clara said you're not a poor guy. He said it after the applications were filed. Of course, it's good to have something to live on while my wife is at home with the baby. Well, how are you doing? What do you do for a living?" "Where? Nothing," mumbled the guy. "Work is bad now. They pay me a trifle everywhere." Christopher nodded. "That's true. But no one ever got rich on a paycheck like that. You should try to organize something yourself." "All right, it's solvable. But what do you live on?" "My parents give me a little. They've got." "Well, I see. I see. Don't go on." The future father-in-law waved away. "Well, Clara?" He looked at his daughter. "Congratulations. You found yourself a lazy man with an ego and a slacker. And this daughter," Christopher unceremoniously pointed his finger at Ethan. "This one, look closely, is your future husband. What do you think of that?" Well, the girl lowered her eyes. "Things are different now, aren't they?" "Right, Ethan. He's a family man now. I think he'll be able to work and provide for me and the baby." "You think so?" Dad grinned. "Well, think. It's my business, but if you want to know what I think, I'll tell you this. This Major doesn't like to work and doesn't know how to work. If he could do something, he wouldn't be on his parents' back. And if he didn't know how to do something, but he loved it, he'd be trying to learn something. But that was before, Daddy, and now. He doesn't love you either." Christopher went on. "And his father is, I apologize, like a pig, a snow-white swan." "Come on, Dad. Shut up. You asked for my opinion, so stay out of my way. And here's my advice to you, my daughter. Send him away. Right after the baby's born, he's no use to you and won't be. This way you'll have a child in marriage, and you'll get rid of the stone around your neck. Girl, you're beautiful, you're smart. You'll find yourself a nice guy with a head and a heart. And this one," he glanced contemptuously at Ethan, "he'll never be a man again. He's all right on the face, handsome, but there's nothing good about him except his face. The face changes with time." Ethan gritted his teeth. He's in trouble. Now this car mechanic with 3 grades of education is going to sit there and insult him. "Dad, don't," asked Clara, pointing her eyes at the groom. "It's unpleasant for him. And in general, of course, you have a lot of life experience, but maybe you're wrong. But it's unlikely." "Can I," said Ethan, who up to this moment had been gloomily silent, "stop insulting me? I'm your daughter's fiancé and the father of your grandson. Who gave you the right to behave like this?" "Hiya, nobody yet. If you want to prove your worth, get a job, think about a place to live. And by the way, start taking care of your fiancé. She's pregnant. She needs rest, proper nutrition, light emotions. The doctor said Clara needs fruit and vitamins. Go and think about it and get her that, for starters." The next day, Ethan was walking through the yard of his fiancé's house and could not answer himself the question, what was he doing here? A heavy bag of fruit and vitamins for Clara was weighing down his arm. Humanitarian aid for pregnant fools and very heavy. Christopher opened the door for him himself and held out his hand for the bag. "Did you bring fruit?" "Good for you, come on." "Clara is not at home now. I sent her to the cottage in the morning. Let her get some fresh air. She'll be back on Thursday. I'll tell her you came by." Ethan was not invited to come in, and he remained standing, staring dumbfoundedly at the cheap sodden door. "Why am I here?" Again he asked himself, but there was no definite answer to that question. Most likely because not to come to leave Clara, no matter how stupid she was, would be to agree with the characterization that this disgusting type, her father, had given him. And also because he was scared. This really Christopher, a man without a tower, such a man will unscrew his head and then surrender to the authorities, but only unscrewed, it is no longer screwed back in place. Screw it all and skip town right now. And then what? Daddy has long ago and quite unambiguously made it clear to his children that either after receiving a certificate of higher education, they stay to work at his company, or they cannot count on the inheritance and at least some financial support. This means that to run away is like agreeing to a miserable existence, to be lost on the streets, and to fend for themselves. Ethan shakes his head, as if he hoped to shake her out of her fears and any other unnecessary thoughts. I had to think of some way out of this, and as soon as possible. But, as it turned out, no reasonable ideas appeared, and it was clear that he could not do without his sister's advice. Clara stood at the window, watching Ethan nervously pacing the sidewalk in front of the house, probably thinking about something, and certainly nervous. "He sent you some fruit," my father shouted from the room. "I left it on the table in the kitchen." "And why did you deceive him that I'm at the cottage?" asked the girl. "I heard." Christopher stood on the threshold of the room, leaned his shoulder against the jamb, and looked intently, very seriously at his daughter. "I wanted to buy you some time," he said, "for you to think calmly whether you want him or not. You see what he's like. He's neither fish nor flesh. A slug. Then why did you ask him to marry you?" "I pressured him, of course. I couldn't listen to him go on and on about you. But tell me something. Do you really want to marry him, that lazy bum? A child without a husband isn't very nice, but if you look at it another way, Maybe it's better to have no husband than that dry fruit of yours. I love him, I confessed. You love him, of course. It's understandable. While you were dating, hugging, kissing, all was well with you. But it's the same for everyone until there are no responsibilities, no children. He's a handsome guy, looking in love, holding your hand, talking nicely. Love, carrots, all those beautiful things. And how did things get complicated? So where did it go, his love? I heard everything. He didn't tell you, Clara. Even though we didn't plan it, we'll get through it and I'll be with you, no matter what you decide, did he? He didn't, did he? No. He started talking about how the baby might not be his and other nasty stuff that made me want to throw up. And I'm not squeamish. I was. So let me ask you a different question. Will you have something to love him for when the passion passes? And it will pass. Can you believe me? There will remain the character of a man, his deeds, for what you can respect. You can despise, you can love, and you can hate. Will there be something to love him for then? Clara lowered her head and bit her lip. Daddy, she said after a short silence. I don't know now. Ethan was the prince from the TV series. Tall, slender, dark-eyed in his movements, the lightness of a predator and the fluidity of water flowing from one position to another as naturally, easily, beautifully as if a river were flowing. And his speech was like a river, as smooth, unhurried, and sometimes like a noisy stream. Clara thought he must smell of water. Fresh, clean, fresh from the spring, but it was the opposite. When she hugged Ethan, she could always smell the woods, resin and herbs and something else, but it was so intoxicating that it seemed impossible to break the embrace. To stand like this, pressed together, and breathe in the smell of my beloved. Inhale it and do not stop, do not get distracted. You're a river, and it smells like a real forest. She used to say, why a river? I don't know. They say I'm a river, but I'm not. But you didn't. You're like a river. You've come into my life and filled it all with you. So you're a river? No, I'm just yours. How many of these conversations have they had? How many unbreakable embraces? How can you forget that now? And now Ethan was nothing like his recent self. Where did he get all this insolence, meanness, anger? The way he kept saying he didn't know if she'd been faithful to him or if she'd gone out with others, as if she could look at others. She didn't notice anyone but him. Clara still loved him, but realized more and more clearly she loved her memories of Ethan and the real him she didn't know at all. She doesn't want to know. I don't want to be a daddy. I don't want to be a daddy. Ethan kept repeating himself. With each word, he banged his head against the soft back of the chair. Nancy was quietly looking at her fresh manicure and didn't seem to notice what was happening. She was silently worrying about when her brother would finally calm down enough to talk to her. Ethan groaned for a few more minutes, then lifted his head. Why don't you say something? He asked in a perfectly normal voice. Don't you see your brother's life is a disaster? You could have said something, consoled him, given him some advice. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. Ethan, you're a fool. Aphoristically, she said. It's pretty clear, he said. What do we do now? That gastropub has a crazy daddy. He'll kill me, and he won't regret it. You. Is that have you talk about the girl you love? I never loved her. Ethan moaned. She's cute, she's pretty, and I got carried away for a while. But what kind of love? You have to pay for pleasure. Nancy said admonishingly. As for everything else, however, for stupidity, for ignorance, for beauty and talent. But pleasure usually costs more than anything else. Thank you for the informative lecture. The brother bowed. But what should I do, huh? so I don't have to go back to it. The sister began slowly, looking up at the ceiling. I warned you that your games in bad neighborhoods to the suburbs and affairs in bedroom communities will not lead to good. But since you didn't listen to me, and you, she pointed her finger at her brother. You didn't. Now we need to find out what options we have to solve the problem. The first option is to offer the girl money for an abortion and make sure she gets proper care and maintenance. Dad, tell her that horror, spontaneous miscarriage, but you will cope. You can overcome this grief together, supporting each other. You don't know that fool, Clara. Ethan said glumly. There's no way she's going to go along with this. People like her have only one goal in this life, to have a bunch of children like a pig and sit among them contentedly while a man works for her and all this litter. So this option is out. Nancy stated nonchalantly. Let's move on to the second option. It's simpler, but also more complicated. Say it. Leave everything as it is and raise the child together. Wow. One option is better than the other. Do you have any other interesting ideas? A third option. I haven't thought of a third one yet. Maybe I should just drop off the radar, sorely suggested the guy. Why? It's quite possible. Just change your phone number, leave, and that's it. There'd be no place for us to cross paths with her then. He grinned. We'll be on different paths. And her dad's a crazy tire man. He won't be able to find me. Nancy shook her head. No, my dear brother, that won't do. I won't say the platitudes about the fact that if you do, you'll lose your father's financial support in no time. That's half the trouble, if you ask me. Money can be earned. The trouble is, you're incapable of taking care of yourself. And do you know why? And why is that? Asked my brother. Because the created problems need to be solved, and you just want to merge quietly, disappear. Yes, almost all men do that. Ethan was indignant. You'd think. And that's why they almost all live as they have to. The girl said, they work for miserable wages, live in shanty towns, and in the evenings drink the cheap liquor they're sold under the guise of beer. That's pretty much all of yours. You want to be like that. What's that got to do with it? It's got everything to do with it. Nancy sighed. That it's not those who run away from problems who live well, but those who aren't afraid to face them. Those who solve them. You have a problem, and you want to run away from it. In that case, how long after you get your inheritance will you be on the street? If, of course, you get it at all, and not crawl back under your parents' wing after you've been fired for stupidity from your supermarket cashier position? Inheritance. Ethan grumbled. What's there to talk about now? Dad's health is good. That's fine. It seems to be as far away from the inheritance as the moon. But it'll come sooner or later. And frankly, I wouldn't want you to give up your share and then settle down to support me, said the sister. There was so much cold certainty in her tone that Ethan felt uneasy. Nancy was, unlike her brother, the pride of the family, a strategist's mindset, independence, the ability to make quick decisions and put them into action, and a persistence so persistent that God forbid she should dream of it. A robot, not a woman. Ethan joked, but deep down he admired his sister. That's why he ran to her for advice whenever he had the slightest difficulty. Usually she managed, thinking quickly, assessing the situation correctly, and giving excellent advice. But today, it seemed that even Nancy could not give him any advice, but she spurred his own imagination. You're a good girl, sister, he said and clapped his hands together. I think I've figured out what to do. The beer was disgustingly diluted. Ethan forced himself to swallow what was already in his mouth, but he set the mug aside. The bulky man sitting across from him was also his future father-in-law. He looked at the guy with bewilderment. "Do not like it?" he asked. "You'll have to excuse me, Christopher," replied Ethan. "You know, I'm not very good with beer." But I couldn't explain to this fat and aging man that beer was at least something you could try at Oktoberfest before it became too popular. Well, or at least in the Czech Republic. And what you can buy for pennies at the supermarket is not beer. It's rat poison. Suit yourself. He smiled. But I like to drink beer in the evening at work. You know, you get tired, so here it is. He lifted the bottle. Relaxes me, relieves stress, and puts me in a positive frame of mind. Ethan nodded politely. That's what my father says. Christopher immediately seized on the mention. He's a good man, your father, a hard worker. By the way, it's about time we got to know each other. What do you think? Because look, you and Clara are about to get married. You'll soon become parents, and we haven't even seen the matchmakers yet. It's not right. Yes? Ethan mumbled uncertainly. But, you know, we have such a family, such a... Well, family is family. The man interrupted him. Whatever they are, they're our own. You just bring them to us, and we'll make friends. Ethan was silent. You're in trouble, you idiot. You're in trouble. He should have listened to his sister, because she'd always told him to socialize with people in his own circle. And she was right on the money, you bastard. Well, what? The son of an entrepreneur. For a minute, a man with 2 higher education, who for fun is studying a 5th foreign language, may have in common with the daughter of the owner some lousy tire shop. He's just a common bastard anyway, and his daughter is the same, even if she is beautiful. Fool! Ethan berated himself for the umpteenth time this evening. If you want a taste of tart exoticism, you can have it. You know he lied, following a momentary burst of inspiration. I don't want you to meet my parents because I'm embarrassed, because they're, well, how should I put it, unusual people. Do they drink? Christopher raised his eyebrows. So, yeah, sure, it's a scary thing. But you can talk to them. If they want to quit, so I will organize treatment. I have a brother in New York just from addiction. He's a great doctor. He's got a whole clinic. Sure, yeah, I'll have to talk to them about it. Maybe they'll agree. That would be very good. It'll be fine, Ethan, as long as they want to live sober. The boy's got his head down. I'd like to postpone your acquaintance after all, especially since Clara's pregnant. Why should she go to all this trouble? She doesn't. But will they even come to the wedding? I guess they said they'd try, but they didn't make any firm promises. So we'll meet them in a week. Christopher shouted contentedly and took another big sip of his disgusting beer. The wedding was bearing down on Ethan at the speed of sound, but now he was looking forward to it. Each new day brought the lad closer to the coveted day, the release. The plan he had devised was simple and brilliantly thought out. They, that is, both Clara and her crazy father should be disappointed in me. He informed his sister. They should realize that it's better to be a single mother than to be married to a jerk like me. With tireless energy, he invented new ways to convince the bride, especially the future father-in-law, of his repulsive nature. When do you think you'll get a job? Christopher snapped at him. Your bride is not an elephant. 2 years pregnant will not walk. But I'm looking for something. Ethan turned around. I haven't found anything yet. All right, you'll come to my tire shop. I'll teach you everything myself. I'll pay you well. If you work well, you'll start earning well. This conversation was repeated with depressing regularity. And in the end, Ethan saw a suitable occasion to demonstrate once again his unsuitability for family life. The only thing left to do was to summon up the courage. I don't want to work. Bluntly, he declared one day to Clara and Christopher, "Why should I? My parents still give me money, and as soon as the child is born, I will also get an allowance from the state." How much did Clara find out? But no matter how much it is, it's still money. And when the baby grows up? Asked the girl anxiously, looking at the groom. The allowance will end, and the older the child, the more money is needed for him. The allowance will run out, but Clara, the parents won't. Ethan assured her. And when it ends and but so then there will be an inheritance, and not a small one. By the way, I've already decided what we'll spend it on. We'll buy a big house and rent it out. It's for passive income. You do nothing and the money drips. It's beautiful. And you and I will go to Thailand. Life is very cheap there. We'll have enough rent money for 2 people. Why 2? What about the baby? Or don't you plan to take him with you? Oh, Clara, Ethan said reproachfully, you can't just think of yourself. Where do you want to take the baby? To Thailand? No, you can't even ask me that. Of course, you shouldn't take the child with you. Because of the climate change, insects, kindergarten, school, medicine. In short, we'll leave him here. Let Grandma and Grandpa take care of him, and we'll go there to rest. We can come and visit once in a while. But wait, Ethan. Why? Christopher stepped in. I think it's a great plan. We can implement it. At least I'll make a man out of my grandson. Daddy will not teach him anything good. Right, Clara? You're starting again. Offended, Ethan said, and was silent for a long time. That's how you try to offend me, to humiliate me. And for what? Because I want to arrange everything so that Clara and the child would be happy. It's better to separate mother and child. Ethan was silent, but in his heart he felt that he had just won a small but important victory. Let them continue to think that he was a foolish, worthless, twitchy idiot from whom nothing could be expected. The next day he showed up at his fiancée's house drunk and diligently made noise in the entryway, until Christopher peeked out of the apartment and threatened to call the police. Oh, come on, Dad. Ethan swung the bottle in a cartoonish fashion. Some of the wine spilled over his head and ran down his face. Ethan wiped away the alcohol and licked his palms. Christopher looked at him in disgust, which was exactly what the groom's script called for. Oh, he said, smiling stupidly. Can I call you Dad? Dad? Dad is just right. It's you. Go home, Christopher advised him. Go before I turn you into the police. So how do you go home? Ethan was indignant. I'm here to see my sweetheart. Yes, Clara, yes, my little darling. Come here, come here. He pinched his bride's cheek. I can't do anything without my Clara. I can't do anything without her, Daddy. I can't eat, I can't sleep, and I can't see you, said Christopher. Get out, and don't you dare breathe your booze on my daughter. You'll come back when you're sober. Having waited a few more days after the drinking performance, Ethan again came to the guests and demanded a wedding present from his future father-in-law. So you don't have to worry about what to get us. You know how they give us all kinds of awful junk, and then people agonize, they don't know where to put these gifts. So let's make a wish list, like some people do. Do what? Well, wish list means wish list. The guests will familiarize themselves with it, and then everyone will decide what to give from this list, and there are only the necessary things. I think you'll give us an apartment, he said, but I'm telling you right away, we need a 2-room apartment, a child. And what will your parents give? Christopher grinned. Maybe a summer house? You put it on your wish list. The child will need fresh air and vitamins. By the way, I've already looked at a nice cottage near the city. All communications are already pulled up, sewerage, water, electricity. There is near a pine forest, very clean air, and there is a garden, so we won't have to grow apples ourselves. Daddy?" Clara laughed, but Ethan stopped her with a gesture. "My parents will support us," he said habitually, adding a note of resentment to his voice. "Isn't that enough for you?" Christopher sighed and shook his head. "Unfortunately, yes. If they had raised you to be a man, I'd be much more grateful, honestly." "Clara," he turned to his daughter, "why do you need such a husband? Maybe you'll change your mind while there's still time." "Daddy," the girl was confused. "You wanted to have a child in marriage, didn't you?" "I did." Dad didn't disagree. "But look at him, that father. Than such a father, maybe it's better." "Clara," Ethan raised his head in offense. "Do you see what's going on here? Your father wants to separate us. Are you just going to keep quiet? Let the child grow up without a father? Because you see, Christopher, you don't like me, do you?" Clara smiled and waved her hands. "Honestly, Ethan, it seems to me that you yourself want us to break up. I just don't understand why you won't say it openly. Because your crazy dad would cut me to ribbons." Ethan thought, but he only said one thing out loud. "Don't be silly, the wedding's in a week." His sister was skeptical of Ethan's plan. It was her nature to be skeptical, she said, and she was probably right. But Ethan still believed in his own strength. Just a little more to go, just another week. They're already at their limit, barely hanging on. Just a little more patience, and the wedding day's in a week. My sister reminded me. "Exactly," Ethan exclaimed happily. "Exactly. That's just about the day of the wedding. And that's when I'm going to have my main gig, after which, oh, Nancy, I'm going to have such a party to celebrate my release. We'll go to the Canaries. We'll get some people together, rent a beach and party from morning till night till the ambulances come for us." Sister only gave me a sharp shoulder. "Let's see if your idea doesn't fail," she snorted. "Don't say gop until you've jumped over it." "I've already jumped over, my dear sister." "I have." Ethan laughed and hugged Nancy tightly. Clara was pensively going through the countless ruffles on her wedding dress, the dress itself hanging on its hinges on the closet door. Christopher looked into his daughter's room and sat down beside her. "It's beautiful," he said, looking at the wedding dress. "The ribbons, the lace. I never understood these wedding dresses. After all, for one day it is, and the wedding is off and in the closet. But beautiful. Yes, beautiful." Clara let go of the caressing fabric from her fingers and turned to her father. "This is not what I dreamed of, Dad. Not at all. And now I'm looking at this dress and thinking, who am I going to wear it for? Ethan?" The man felt that now the girl was ready to tell him something important, special, and kept silent, afraid to scare her mood. "You know, when I met Ethan," she said slowly, "I felt like I'd met some kind of fairy prince, and not just because he was handsome. He took such good care of me, drove me to school, picked me up after class, fed me at restaurants. Then we went out, went to the movies. Every day?" Dad asked. "Every day. And it seemed to me that it was like going to the movies. And nothing about it made you suspicious." I did. It was only a couple of weeks later that I suddenly thought, doesn't he have any business of his own? I mean, we were together all the time. From morning till night. It's like he's got no school, no job, nothing. Nothing but fun. I asked him, and he looked at me so strangely and said, "I can afford to rest." But here he is all resting and resting. Father snorted. "And does not get bored." "Yes, and when I found out I was pregnant, I thought that now everything would change for sure." Ethan will realize that now he can't go out like he used to, thinking only about pleasures. That a child will be here soon, and that's a responsibility. You have to think about the future. But the further I go, the more I realize that he's not going to think about anything. You see the way he acts, it's like he's getting cocky on purpose. Christopher didn't know what to say. And what can you say? Clara saw and said it all herself. You can still replay everything, he said softly. Just tell that bum there's no wedding. It's my fault, too. When I found out about it, I was furious. I thought I'd do anything, and the child would be born in marriage, and then the grass would grow back. But you know how they treated it in my time. It was considered a disgrace. That's what I thought out of habit, and then I looked around and everything had changed. What's the point? Now many women give birth to children, but they're in no hurry to get married. What can you do if you're not lucky enough to have a father? We'll raise the kid, work, bring him up. You'll meet a good guy. And this one, what's he worth to you? He's a fool. If only I'd realized who he was before. Sadly, smiled Clara. And now I feel like I have to go all the way. And I keep thinking, well, at least he said that there will be no wedding, even if he refused to marry. Why wait for him to say that? My father was surprised. Can you do it yourself or not? But do you want to? I'll tell him, and I'll throw him down the stairs with my great pleasure, eh? The wedding is the day after tomorrow, Dad, reminded my daughter. Everything is ready, money spent, invitations, restaurant. How can I cancel it all? How then to look people in the eyes? Give it up. Christopher laughed. Who cares? Changed her mind and that's it. If you don't like it, the door's over there. No, you can't do that. Can you marry a jerk? I made a mistake. What can I do? So I'll have to go all the way, said the daughter. And the father realized that no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't change her mind. She feels sorry for her. She doesn't want to marry that Ethan of hers. She's embarrassed in front of others, but in front of herself, in front of her child. Ethan was getting ready for the wedding. He'd been shopping all day, but he hadn't found anything suitable. What kind of discrimination is this? Why aren't there stores for people who like tattered clothes? What do fashion designers care about? Are they creating some kind of fashion collection? One uglier, one uglier. And where, you may ask, are the fashion collections for the homeless, where in the end, you can get at least a homeless man's masquerade costume? Shopping had worn him out. Ethan was about to fall into despair, but then a brilliant idea struck him. Why look for special clothes? You could just make your own. A pity, of course, but what not to sacrifice for a great cause? All it takes is a little dirt. That's it. Ethan flew home on wings. Once home, he got down to business with all the imagination he could muster. First, he wet the soles of his sneakers with water and carefully walked in them over his sweater and jeans, which he spread out on the floor. The prints were quite convincing, but they weren't the only thing he could do. He found some pistachio ice cream in the fridge and smeared it on his jeans and sweater. Then Ethan poured some instant coffee into a jar and poured it on his sweater. His jeans got a few ketchup stains and a couple of greasy butter stains. Only the finishing touches remained. Ethan, armed with a pair of scissors, carefully cut the sweater along the seam and ripped off the sleeve. Then he stretched the sweater in all directions to add bagginess and was satisfied with his creation. The elegant summer sweater was now unrecognizable. The jeans were a different story. Despite the ketchup, ice cream, and butter, the stupid pants still didn't look bad enough. Ethan stomped around in his sneakers just in case, cut off the back pocket, leaving it dangling on a couple of verses, and in addition, poured a glass of water on one pant leg, and poured instant coffee right on the wet spot, then began laboriously rubbing the rich coffee powder right into the fabric. It would be more expressive that way. It really did fix things. Now the pants looked just right. They looked like they'd been pulled out of a dumpster. Ethan marveled aloud, taking another critical look at his clothes. His wedding outfit was ready. Clara sat in the kitchen, melancholy, stirring the sugar in her cup. The wedding dress hung in its former place. The girl had glanced at it without interest in the morning and passed it by. "You're not dressed yet," surprised Christopher. He saw that his daughter was sitting in her pajamas, her hair gathered in a shaggy bundle, and did not even try to look at the clock. He himself had already managed to wake up, eat breakfast, and take a shower. Now he only had to get dressed and could go to marry his daughter. But only the daughter was not in a hurry. Soon the groom will come, and you are unwashed, sitting in your pajamas. How can you do that? What's the matter with you, Clara? Don't you feel well? "I don't want to get married, Papa," she said, without any expression. "I don't. To Ethan, no, you shouldn't marry a man like that. I only realized last night you can't. It would be a tragedy. It'd be misery, and I've got a baby to think about. Dad, can we still call it off? Isn't it too late? But you found time to change your mind." The father smiled and patted the girl's hair. "Right on the day of the wedding. Well, better late than never. Your fool is coming, and you'll tell him. Or do you want me to tell him?" "No, Dad, don't. I'll tell him myself. I'll decide. I'll tell him myself." Clara finally looked up at her father with a tired look. "I haven't slept all night." He understood. "Look at the circles under your eyes. Oh, youth, youth? Don't worry, my child," he said quietly. "You've made the right decision." Ethan looked at himself in the mirror again with pleasure. Perfect. He had thought of everything, or almost everything. No, the watch had to come off. He smeared a little olive oil on his hair to make it stick together, then sprinkled it with flour. It was perfectly messy and even somewhat dusty, and the stubble on his face, which he hadn't gotten rid of in 2 days, had grown back sloppily. It remained to pay attention to his nails. The question of manicure was solved very simply. Ethan went outside and sat down on the nearest lawn, digging into the ground for a while. His sneakers, which he had also covered with earth, looked a little more civilized than necessary, and the guy got rid of the laces. Now everything was perfect. It was time to go after the bride. Just before Clara's house, Ethan stopped and took a few deep breaths and exhaled. And so the final act of the play Escape from Family Life began. An important key moment in his plan. Now it is necessary to play. Well, play brightly and even, probably brilliantly. Otherwise tonight he'll find himself a married man. The door was opened for him by Clara herself. "Ethan? What's the matter with you?" "Clara!" He howled and fell to his knees. "Clara, I'm so bad, I'm worse." "Clara, at least beat me. Will it make me feel better?" "Beat me, beat me." "Ethan, Ethan, calm down. What's this masquerade? She's pregnant, she can't fight. Do you want me to beat you up?" suggested Christopher, who heard Ethan's cries. "Clara, get away. Let me get that slacker." "But Dad," the girl was angry. "You've got time for jokes. The man is so happy." "Without much sympathy," said Christopher. "Maybe he should call an ambulance?" "Clara," howled Ethan. "Clara, my darling girl, my favorite, how are we going to live with you now?" "Daddy's broke. They took everything from us for debts, every last cent. There's no money, no real estate. They took away all the shares. We have nothing left. How are we going to live now? How can I marry you now? My beauty, my Clara, my darling, my darling, my darling. Don't be silent. Tell me something, please. Oh, the girl sighed. Thank God, honestly. What? Ethan stopped howling in surprise and raised his head. Clara, we can't get married now, can we? That's a good thing, she said sincerely. I'm sorry, Ethan. It's probably my own fault for not saying it sooner. But you realize that. What kind of family are you? You don't want it. Neither do I. What about your dad going broke? Of course he is, but maybe it's not that bad. I'm sure he's not that broke or anything. Don't you want to marry me? Ethan interrupted her. Well, yes, I don't. And it's a good thing we realized it before we got married. You don't want to marry me, he repeated, shocked. Clara sighed. I don't. I'm sorry. Ethan rose to his feet and looked at the girl resentfully. So I've been freaking out that now we can't get married. And you? Fuck you. Have a nice stay. Ethan rushed down the stairs and thought that this was it. He was running towards his long-awaited freedom, but for some reason he wasn't happy about it. Good girl, said Christopher. Well done, but don't take offense at him. It's just a slip of the tongue. Don't feel bad, baby. You did the right thing. And Ethan jumped out into the street. Without slowing down, ran away from this house, away from Clara, away from her father, away from her child. From this whole nightmare story, for which he was ashamed and for some reason also very offended. As if he had just been betrayed by his most trusted friend. Only now, when everything was behind him, he wanted to ask himself, what was so bad about marrying this sweet, loving girl? And would it have been so terrible to become a father? But it was both painful and pointless to think about it now. He had thought for too long that he was being trapped, lured like an animal into a trap, and he had been ready to do anything to break free. And now he wasn't needed, and it turned out that no one was trying to catch him. And the trap was not a trap. It's he himself made up a hell of a lot of things. But what about it now? What's the point? He ran along the asphalt path, and it seemed that this run could go on, if not forever, then for many, many millennia. Ethan never tired and never wanted to stop, ever. Maybe one day he would collapse from fatigue somewhere in Cambodia, but that would be later, when he was exhausted. Only then, and not before. But this time life decided everything for him. A persistent phone call made him stop. What? Ethan bellowed into the receiver. It was Nancy. Her sister, which was absolutely unbelievable, was sobbing at the top of her voice. What are you crying about? I can't understand a word you're saying. Ethan, come at once. Dad was in an accident. He wasn't saved. Can you hear me? Where is he now? Is he in the hospital? Is he in surgery right now? Do you need anything? How about blood? We're the same type. Ethan, Nancy screamed. Dad's dead. He's dead, you know. You're lying, whispered Ethan. You're lying. Aren't you, Nancy? I don't believe you. I don't believe you. I don't believe you. He shouted so loudly that an elderly woman with a dog on a leash, passing by, flinched and stepped away. I don't believe you. Ethan shouted, I don't believe it. You're lying. Nancy, I don't believe you. But he did. Nancy wouldn't joke like that. He knew it. I'm on my way to the lineup. Said the sister through her tears. You come too. I can't on my own. Come, I'm waiting for you, Ethan. Will you come? I'll come, he whispered. I'll come right now. The rest of it went on like an endlessly sad movie. and everything Ethan remembered was somehow very vague. No matter how hard Ethan tried, he couldn't remember how he'd gotten a cab and gotten to Nancy. He only remembered calling his sister from the car and trying to find out where he was going and where she was waiting for him. And Nancy was sobbing, mixing up addresses, couldn't remember anything. Then she handed the phone to someone and the address was found. Ethan found her almost unconscious, sedated. He had to identify his father's body. Ethan had heard that morgues could be cold, but for some reason he felt neither cold nor warm or anything. His father lay covered with a sheet, and when Ethan looked at his face, he saw almost no damage. That pleased him for some reason. Why? He couldn't remember that either. Maybe he just didn't want his father's face to be disfigured. The funeral, another moment of reverence, lingered in his memory. Ethan only remembered that his sister, despite her grief, had been able to pull herself together fairly quickly and had looked solemnly calm at the funeral, standing at his father's coffin. Ethan was not calm, and he was not calm either. He couldn't make himself feel anything, nothing at all, as if all his emotions had been numbed or taken away at once. He kept watching his father's coffin being lowered into the ground, and only one question kept him in suspense. Why? Why did his father need money? Why had he worked so hard to earn it? Why? Why did he hardly ever leave work? Why did he work like a slave in the galleys? What was it all for if it was all over in an instant? Only now Ethan realized that he had always thought that money could protect him from something. I guess it could, but all the money in the world couldn't stop a truck from going into the oncoming lane. Well, that's just how it is. Ethan couldn't get that thought out of his head. And then, sitting next to his sister at the reading of the will, it all became so unimportant. The money, the share in the business, the stock. What did it matter now? He thought about whether his father had time to look up at the sky. How often did he go out with friends? How many times have he sat on the ocean and watched the fiery, tropical sun sink in? Had he ever even seen the ocean? Or had he never had time to go on vacation? Somehow, that was all that began to matter. Nothing else. Hey, he looked up. Nancy, did you say something? I couldn't hear. You know, it doesn't matter though. Nancy. Ethan put his hand on his sister's shoulder. I want to give up my share of the inheritance in your favor. What? She was confused. What are you saying? Dad made a will for both of us, and you're saying you want to give up everything. Why? Of the two of us. He smiled. You're the one who's always smarter, more responsible. You're determined, strong. You won't let the cause to which our father devoted his whole life go to the wind. And that's why I want you to have it all. It's only fair and just. You should give it to someone who can hold it together and grow it. Not a schmuck like me. I'd really spend it all in a year and end up with nothing. That'd be okay, but I feel sorry for my dad. He put his whole life into this. There's just one thing I'd like to ask you. It's about Clara. I'm not gonna say anything in front of strangers right now. I'll text you, okay? Nancy covered her eyes for a second, then wiped away a tear with her handkerchief. What about you? She asked quietly. What are you going to do? Ethan? He shrugged. Me, I'll watch the sky, the sunsets. I'm leaving, sis. There's nothing more for me to do in this town. He squeezed the girl's shoulder lightly and walked out into the street. The whole world was waiting for him now. For a brief moment, Ethan wanted to go over to Clara's house to say goodbye to her, but he shouldn't have. He managed to realize something about himself. His father lived for work, and he, Ethan, could stay here and live for the child, but he shouldn't do that. There was nothing he could do. Everything in their family, the truest of naturals, fans. Dad and Nancy are work fans, and Ethan, he's a fan of freedom. And that's probably better than being a fan of parenting. It's bound to break the kid. No, better to watch the sunset. He went to the ticket counter and asked for a one-way ticket. Where to? They asked him. Anywhere. Wait for me, though. Anywhere to the ocean, and preferably south. Ethan stepped off the airplane straight into paradise. At least this place looked a lot like it. Tall palm trees waved in the wind, their huge leaves wreathed in opahalas. A wonderful fragrance of flowers wafted in the air. In the distance, but still close, the ocean offered its waters to the sun. The speech of the passers-by was more like the chirping of birds in the morning spring. "No luggage, sir?" Someone addressed him in passable English. "I don't need it." Ethan smiled. The joy, the fullness of life, made him want to sing. Never before in his life had he felt so free. He had a little money. Enough to eat twice at any of the local cafes. And beyond that, he was too lazy to think about it. Tomorrow seemed so far away. There would be a day, there would be food. He went forward, not choosing the road. All paths here would sooner or later lead to the ocean. Nancy had no difficulty in finding Clara's address. She had arrived there in the morning to be sure to find her brother's ex-fiancé at home. She looked at her guest with a noticeably rounded belly, a little plump and surprised. "So it is you, Ethan's sister?" she asked at last. "How odd that you don't look like him at all." "Unfortunately, you're right, Clara." Nancy smiled. "Not in appearance, not in character, not in content. But that's not why I came here. I know my brother well, Clara, and I know that Ethan is, well, to put it mildly, not the most responsible person in the world. That's just the way he is, despite his many virtues. But I'm not a stranger to his child, and I'm his own aunt. And if you don't mind—" "Oh, so you want to see the baby?" She was delighted. "Well, of course, whenever you want. What are we talking about?" "I would like not only to see, but also to take care of my nephew." Nancy corrected the girl. "To take over, so to speak, fatherly duties." "Oh, come on, really. No, please, listen to me, because it concerns the baby and his future. First of all, you, Clara, will receive a certain amount of money every month for the baby. Don't argue. Ethan, and you may not know this, has renounced his part of the inheritance in my favor. So I've decided that I'm going to dispose of it this way, with part of the money going to child support and the rest for your baby to inherit afterward. Well, in short, when his time comes to receive the inheritance, and until then I will try to see to it that the share of my nephew did not depreciate, but on the contrary, became more. I hope you won't object and argue with me. No. It is obvious to me, for example, that this is the right and just decision. You won't challenge it, will you?" "No, I know you wouldn't." "Nancy, I just wasn't ready. I understand everything you could tell me, that you're not in need, that your father will help you. But I still think it's justice. Don't deny me the chance to right my brother's wrong. I beg you very much. 8 months in the tropics will get to anyone." Ethan knew that now. Personal experience is nothing to be trifled with. Don't confuse tourism with emigration. Tourists fly in for a week's vacation, decide they're in paradise. Here, the sun is always shining and the ocean breaks its waves on the shore, and over the shore carried snow-white seagulls. For some reason, he realized now that it was time to go home. He had a sudden urge to see his sister, to see how she was doing, and to visit Clara. The baby must have been born by now, though Ethan had stopped counting the months long ago. He just lived, not caring about the numbers on the calendar or the days of the week. Sometimes hired for a paltry wage to load bananas for export. Sometimes for a bowl of food, he agreed to wash dishes in local eateries. Sometimes begging. Once even had an affair with a pretty mulatto. But alas, the passion quickly faded because they could not explain themselves to each other. Miracle Girl chattered in some unknown language and did not understand a word of English. But still their love passion allowed Ethan to live without hunger for several weeks. His beauty was a great cook, and there was always food in the house. That marvelous little girl worked in a cafe as a cook. There was a brief period in this strange life of his, full of coincidence, when Ethan got involved with a local gang, and for a while he robbed them and ran away from the police. Though, to be honest, he hadn't had to run away very often. The police here had an easy time turning a blind eye to a lot of things. If, of course, to offer the officers of the law a small cash reward, in general, it was very understandable. There were far more petty thugs than policemen in this banana paradise, and everyone wanted to live in peace. Strangely enough, Ethan liked it. At first, it even seemed that he would not part with his new friends and would eventually become the new Pablo Escobar. He was prophesied to have a great future. At first, it rounded his head and encouraged him, but then Ethan somehow got bored of it all at once. Who does not know, he may think that the life of any romantic from the big road can be anything dangerous, luxurious, frightening, saturated. But Ethan has personally experienced that even in such a profession, there is enough of its routine. One day he just left, quietly, without saying goodbye or throwing a party. His associates probably thought he'd been hit by a bullet in one of the endless street shootouts. It was a common occurrence. No one was looking for Ethan. And now he was standing on the shore, thinking that spring was probably in full swing back home, and for the first time in a long, endless time, he wanted to walk the familiar streets and hear his native speech. Yes, it was time to go back. He said to himself, "It's definitely time now." If he got a job loading bananas again, he could save up for a ticket in a month. Clara was cradling her tiny son and softly singing a lullaby to him. Christopher looked into his daughter's room and looked at two of the dearest and most beloved people in the world, Clara and baby No. Nothing is more precious than this. He thought, for the umpteenth time there isn't, and there won't be. Life, ongoing, endless from father to daughter, from daughter to grandchild. Clara caught her father's gaze and smiled. He had already fallen asleep. She said in a whisper. Christopher gently took the child in his arms and moved him to the crib. "Do not regret it?" he asked. "For what?" The daughter did not understand. He did not know what to answer. Probably about everything at once. About having a baby. About Ethan not working out. "Nonsense, Dad. Why should I regret it? I had such a wonderful son. And Ethan, what the hell with him? Besides, Father has noticed that you seem to have a new boyfriend." Well. You think I didn't notice the way that Doctor looked at you? I even came to see you off in person when you were discharged. You can't be fooled." Clara laughed. "He's kind of looking after me, and I like him a lot too. Although, of course, it's too early to talk about something serious." "What's the hurry?" "There's no hurry." Christopher agreed. No rumbled softly in the crib. Clara came over, but her father gestured for her to stop. "It's all right, I'll do it." He rocked the crib quietly and sang a lullaby to his grandson. Clara looked at her father and her heart warmed. The eternal circle of life from parents to children, from children to grandchildren. And nothing is more important than that nothing. Ethan. Nancy shouted when she saw her brother on the doorstep. He was terribly overgrown, dirty, and dressed in some strange rags, a veritable shambles. But it was her brother. She couldn't help but recognize him. "How I've missed you, little sister, how you've become." Nancy had clearly crossed the threshold between angular girl and young beautiful woman in a matter of months. She had put on a little weight, but it suited her remarkably well. Her cheeks, shoulders, and breasts had plumped up. Her movements had become fluid, and she had dyed her hair a couple of shades darker, just enough to accentuate her fair skin and emphasize her eyes. "How beautiful you've become." Ethan said sincerely, "And you?" "I've been going places no decent person should go. I'll tell you about it someday, or even write a book." Later, his sister interrupted him. "Tell me the most important thing. Did you come back for good? I mean back to a normal human life. You see, I need someone I can trust." "No, Nancy, I'm sorry." He even put his hands out in front of him, like he wanted to protect himself from his sister's words. "I can't. I wanted to see you. Just to be home. It's been a while, but you can't ask for more than that. I wish I could help you, but it's not my thing. Constancy, business, home, I'll only make things worse. I'll run away at the worst possible moment." "Then what?" "But maybe you could at least think about it." Nancy suggested it. "It's not like I'm suggesting you chain yourself to the office. We could find you something remotely, even something as simple as that, for starters. And then before you know it, you'll be up to your neck in business." He stopped his sister gently. "It's not for everyone. Sis, people like you like it, but it doesn't suit me at all. No offense to me, but suit yourself." Nancy lowered her head with a sigh. "I'm sorry, of course, but I suppose it's true. Everyone should do his own thing, what his soul is drawn to. You've grown up, sister." Ethan grinned. "So have you." She answered him in the same tone. "You haven't changed either. Have you been to see Clara? She's married, but I'm still doing what you asked me to do. She gets good alimony, and when your son gets older." "Thank you, Nancy." Ethan meant what he said. He didn't come in. "You don't need to bring anything up. She's doing well, and I'm glad of it. She's a wonderful person, very kind and sincere. Everyone would be happy to have such a wife. But not you." My sister smiled sadly. "I am not suitable for Constancy. When it catches up with me, I get mad and start doing such a wild thing that I am ashamed of myself. Why should I ruin a good woman's life? Let alone my own child. Does she have a good husband?" "Yes, a very good husband. He's so protective of her and the baby. They're very happy, both Clara and Noah. I think in a couple of years they'll give Noah a brother or sister." "Well, that's good." Ethan smiled. "And now I'm going to go. It was good to see you by. Will you at least spend the night?" My brother smiled nonchalantly. "I'm not used to sleeping indoors unless the weather's really bad, and then I get nervous. But today it's warm." It felt good to be out on the city streets at night. Not that Ethan was looking for trouble, but somehow he was lucky. Or maybe it was just that it was peaceful at home compared to the tropical paradise. He'd never once run into a mugger, never had to deal with hooligans looking for someone to beat up. You could say the city at night was favorable to him. The streets were bright with streetlights, storefronts, and car headlights. He liked to sit on a bench and look at the road, cars passing by, everything like in life. Everyone goes his own way, and someone will get to the goal safely, and someone because of daredevillery will get into an accident, but will get off only a fright. And some, I didn't want to think about them. Ethan had become a surprisingly friendly man. I guess his life as a homeless man His new life had something to do with it. While he was rich, few people treated him kindly, only his colleagues in the racket, and those were gone as soon as he was a pauper. But now he was helped not to die by strangers, whom he knew had only enough. But kind grandmothers' traders sometimes treated him with apples from their stalls. The cook at the street kiosk once took a long look at Ethan squatting on the curb with his alms bowl, then beckoned him over and gave him a huge, freshly cooked shawarma. And that man in the entryway, who wouldn't let the scandalized neighbors kick out in the rain, a vagrant. These are such rays of kindness in a cruel world. You look at it, and you become kinder yourself. And even his seemingly bitchy sister. How happy she was to see his brother. How she persuaded him to stay and return to civilized life, to settle down. But she didn't succeed. Ethan had become too attached to freedom. And freedom he now understood as the complete absence of attachments to addresses, cities, people. Ethan would be howling with longing in a week if he were to go back to his old self. And no money was worth it, no money ever. Today he found a good spot right across the street from the restaurant. People come out of there nice because they're full, and if they're drunk, the catch could be great. True, they were often chased away from fish places, but if you don't worry and try to be inconspicuous, you might get lucky. Without any nostalgia, he looked at the huge, brightly lighted windows and polished steps at the entrance. Was it really only a year ago that he himself had been in places like this every day? Waiters in uniform with polite smiles now seemed to him creatures from another world, and not so long ago he considered them idlers, unworthy of any attention, servants. How are things changing? Ing. A few more coins fell into his coin bowl. Ethan raised his head. Thank you. Ethan? The young woman who had just dropped the change into his piggy bank squatted down and looked straight into the tramp's face. Ethan instinctively pulled back, hiding deeper into his hood. His hair had grown long enough to cover his face, along with his beard. He wouldn't recognize him. He wouldn't even recognize himself now. He couldn't see his old self, no matter how hard he tried. But she did, didn't she? Ethan? Is that you, Ethan? Clara kept repeating his name, but he didn't want to respond to it. He hadn't been Ethan for a long time, at least not the Ethan she knew. You're wrong, girl, he said hoarsely. That's not my name. I'm sorry. Clara straightened up and took out a few bills from her purse. Here you go, please. And sorry again. I thought you reminded me of someone I know. I'm sorry. He nodded without raising his head. Clara, someone called out to her. Ethan squinted his eyes. A young man was standing beside a brand new car, opening the doors for his beloved. I'm coming, she smiled. Her heels clicked on the pavement. The smell of perfume wafted away. She had gone far away, and there was no need to catch up with her. Ethan took some paper money from his piggy bank and hid it under his sweatshirt. Thank you, Clara. Tonight he would have food and maybe even a little beer. What more could a free man dream of?